A 23-year-old woman from Boston who had never held a rifle in her life stood alone in a Wyoming barn during the worst blizzard of the winter with two armed men at the far end and a fevered child dying in the house behind her. She raised the Winchester. She breathed out halfway, and she fired. Her aunt in Boston had paid those men to kill every horse on the ranch, so her husband could never ride home to his family. She did not know that yet. She only knew three children were upstairs and she had made a promise. This is the story of how a barren mail-order bride saved the Blackwood brothers of Thunder Ridge and how she built with her own hands a family that would outlast them all. The stagecoach wheels groaned against the frozen ruts of the mountain road, and Lenora Caroline Whitfield pressed her gloved hand against the small leather valise on her lap as though it contained something more precious than what it did. Inside that battered case was everything she owned in the world. A Bible with torn pages, a tintype photograph of a man who had died 4 years ago, coughing blood into a white handkerchief, an engagement ring wrapped in muslin because she could not bear to look at it and could not yet bring herself to throw it into the Charles River where it belonged. A single change of undergarments, two handkerchiefs, a hairbrush her mother had used before the cholera took her in 1872. That was the inventory of a life. 23 years, and it fit inside a case smaller than a feed sack. The driver up on the box was a grizzled man named Pettigrew, who had not spoken a civil word to her since she boarded in Rawlings Crossing 4 days ago. He spat tobacco juice over the side every quarter hour, with the regularity of a church bell, and when he did speak, it was to curse the horses or the weather, or the distance still remaining. The other passengers had disembarked one by one at smaller stops along the route, a drummer selling Bibles, a widow returning to her brother's homestead, a young man headed for the silver mines at Cook City. By the time the coach lurched through the final mountain pass and descended into the valley that the territorial maps called Thunder Ridge Lenora was the only human cargo remaining. The light was failing. That was the first thing she understood as the coach slowed to a halt at a crossroads that did not deserve the name. Two wagon tracks met in a patch of churned mud, and a pine board nailed to a leaning post bore three words burned into the wood with a hot iron: Blackwood, 2 miles. Pettigrew did not climb down from his box. He simply leaned over the side and looked at her the way a man looks at a calf being led to slaughter, with a kind of distant regret that cost him nothing. "Off you go, ma'am," he said. "Can't take the team up that trail. Too narrow and too steep, and the light's going." Lenora stepped down onto the frozen earth, and the cold struck through the thin soles of her city boots with such startling intimacy that she nearly cried out. Pettigrew swung her trunk off the rack and let it fall into the mud with a careless thud that said everything about his opinion of her prospects. He climbed back into the box without a word of farewell, snapped the reins, and the stagecoach turned in a wide arc and began the long climb back toward Rawlings Crossing. Lenora stood alone at the crossroads. The silence that descended when the coach was finally out of earshot was not the silence she had known in Boston, where even the dead hours of night carried the sounds of horseshoes on cobblestone, the rattle of milk carts, the distant lowing of harbor ships. This was a silence that pressed against the ears like cold water, a silence so complete that she could hear her own breathing and the slow, steady thrum of her pulse behind her eyes. Somewhere far above her, in the granite crags of the three mountains that bordered the valley, a hawk cried once, and the sound carried through the thin air with a clarity that felt unnatural. She turned in a slow circle. The valley opened before her like a cathedral carved by some vast and indifferent hand. To the north rose Thunder Peak, its summit already dusted with the first snow of October. To the east, Eagle's Ridge fell in long stone benches toward a river she could hear but could not yet see. To the west, Silent Mountain stood dark against the last red light of the dying sun, and it was rightly named because no bird called from its slopes and no wind moved through its timber. 2 miles, Pettigrew had said. She looked down at her boots. She looked at the trunk that she could not possibly carry. She looked at the valise that held the entirety of her existence. And then Lenora Caroline Whitfield did what her father had taught her to do in the library of their house on Lewisburg Square, surrounded by the collected works of Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and Emerson. She made a decision. She opened the trunk. She took out a single wool shawl, a spare pair of stockings, and a letter. She closed the trunk and left it there at the crossroads like an offering to the mountain. She tucked the letter into the bodice of her traveling dress, and she began to walk. The letter was folded into thirds and sealed with a smear of red wax. It was the third letter he had sent her, and it was the only thing she had not destroyed during the long nights in her aunt's house on Beacon Hill, when despair had come for her the way it comes for a person who has been told she is worth less than a field that cannot grow wheat. Miss Whitfield, it began, your last letter was plain. I am obliged by your honesty. You say you cannot bear children. I have 3 children already, ma'am. I do not need more. What I need is a woman who will stay. My brothers and I keep a homestead at Thunder Ridge in the Wyoming Territory. The work is hard. The winters are harder still. There is no society within 4 days' ride and no church within 2. I can offer you a roof that does not leak food on the table and the name of a man who keeps his word. I will not pretend to offer more than that. If these terms suit you, come. If they do not, I wish you every kindness in the world. Yours respectfully, Wyatt Blackwood. She had read that letter so many times during the long train journey west that the paper had softened at the folds like old cloth. Each word had been weighed against every other word she had heard in the months since Nathaniel Ashford had stood in St. Paul's Cathedral in front of 300 members of Boston society and informed the assembled crowd that he could not in good conscience take to wife a woman whom Providence had rendered barren. Her Aunt Prudence had heard those words with a thin smile that Lenora would carry to her grave. A well like yours is a well without water, Lenora, her aunt, had said that night, handing her a plate of cold mutton in the servant's kitchen, because the dining room was no longer considered appropriate. No man drinks from such a well. Wyatt Blackwood's letter had said something different. It had said, come if you can stay. Lenora walked. The trail climbed between dark stands of lodgepole pine, and the light drained out of the sky minute by minute, and her boots slipped on the frozen ruts until she learned to plant her feet sideways like a crab. Twice she stopped to wrap her hands deeper into the shawl. Once she stopped because a sound in the timber made her heart beat so hard she could taste it in her mouth, and she stood motionless for a full minute before she understood it was only a mole deer moving downhill to water. She had never seen a deer outside of an illustration in a natural history book. She did not know how large they were, or how silent, or how the breath of a deer in cold air makes a small white plume that floats for a moment among the pines before it disappears. She did not know anything. That was the thought that rose in her as she walked, and it rose without bitterness, because bitterness was a luxury she had already spent. She did not know what the 3 men at Thunder Ridge would look like. She did not know what their house smelled like inside. She did not know if the children would like her or despise her or look through her as though she were glass. She did not know if Wyatt Blackwood had meant every word he had written, or if he had written the way men often write to women they have never met, saying what they believe must be said in order for a thing to happen. She did not know if the man she was walking toward was a good man. She only knew that she could not walk back. The trail crested a low rise and the valley opened before her a second time, and this time she saw the house. It stood in the crook of a small creek that ran down from Silent Mountain, and even in the dying light she could see that it was a good house. 2 stories of squared timber, a long porch running the length of the south side, a shingled roof with 2 stone chimneys pushing out smoke that smelled of pine pitch, and something else she could not name. A barn stood off to the west, larger than the house, with a corral and a bunkhouse beside it. The fence along the eastern boundary had fallen in 3 places and no one had bothered to mend it. Chickens moved in the yard with the last of the daylight. A single lamp was burning in a ground floor window, and the light of it was the warmest thing she had seen in 4 days. 3 men were working in the yard. She stopped at the gate because she could not make herself go further until she had looked at them. They were cutting firewood. 2 of them swung axes in an alternating rhythm so practiced it might have been music, and the third split the rounds with a maul and stacked them in a cord against the south wall of the barn. All 3 were tall. All 3 were broad through the shoulders and narrow at the waist and deeply tanned at the throat and forearms, where the shirt fell open or the sleeves were rolled. All three wore the same kind of working clothes, dark trousers, linen shirts going gray from many washings, suspenders, the heavy boots of men who stand all day on hard ground. They did not know she was there. The smallest thing stopped her. The one splitting rounds with the maul lifted his head to wipe sweat with the back of his wrist, and a strand of auburn hair fell across his forehead. And Lenora saw the way his jaw was set, and she understood without being told that this was the youngest of the three, and that the youngest of the three was angry. She understood something else too. Standing there at the gate with the last red light of the sun touching the tops of the lodgepole pines, she understood that she had spent her entire 23 years in rooms with rugs, and rooms with pianos, and rooms with servants, and rooms with the portraits of dead grandmothers watching from above the fireplace. She had spent her life believing that she knew what the world was because she had read about it in her father's library. The three men in the yard were not something she had read about. She opened the gate. The hinge gave a small iron shriek, and all three heads came up at once. The axes stopped mid-swing. The maul came down on the chopping block with a thunk and stayed there. For the space of perhaps 3 heartbeats, nobody moved, and in that small pocket of stillness, Lenora stood in her mud-splashed traveling dress, with her valise in her hand and the shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, and she looked at the three men, and the three men looked at her. The youngest one spoke first. "Wyatt," he said, and the voice was low and carrying and cold. "You said she came next week. This is a mistake." The man in the middle set his axe down against the chopping block with an unhurried care that made Lenora understand in a way she could not have explained that he was the eldest. He took a red kerchief from his belt and wiped his hands and then his forehead. He walked across the yard toward her, the way a man walks across his own land with no hurry and no doubt about his welcome in it. When he reached the gate, he touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Whitfield," he said. The voice was not what she had expected. She had expected something roughened by weather and silence, and it was, but beneath the roughness there was a tone that she recognized from her father's library, a tone that had been carefully taught to a man once and never quite forgotten. He had been raised by someone who had insisted on certain words and certain courtesies even here, even in a valley 4 days from the nearest church. "I am Wyatt Blackwood," he said. She tried to speak and could not. The cold had done something to her throat. She swallowed and tried again. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I am pleased to make your acquaintance." He took the valise from her hand without asking. The gesture was so simple and so complete that she felt the weight of 4 days of travel lift out of her arm as though it had been nothing at all. He did not look at her face directly. She would learn later that he rarely looked at anyone directly until he knew them. "This is my brother Ezra," he said, nodding toward the man who still stood by the chopping block with the other axe. Ezra was leaner than Wyatt, with dark hair tied back at the nape of his neck, and a face that seemed to exist in a state of quiet attention, as though he were always listening for something in the next room. He did not speak, he simply inclined his head. "And this is Silas," Wyatt said. The youngest one did not incline his head. He stood with the maul still buried in the chopping block, and he looked at Lenora with an expression that she would remember all the rest of her life, because she had never before had a man look at her as though she were a loaded gun that someone had handed him without warning. "Lenora," she said, because she did not know what else to say. "Pardon, ma'am," said Wyatt. "My name is Lenora," she said again. "You may all use it." Ezra almost smiled. She saw it happen at the corner of his mouth, and then she saw him decide not to let it finish. And she understood in that moment that Ezra Blackwood was a man who had spent his life not finishing his smiles. Silas turned his back on her and walked into the barn. "You'll have to forgive my brother," Wyatt said. "He has strong opinions and poor manners. The combination is not improved by company." He offered her his arm. The gesture was so formal, so absurdly formal there in the yard of a mountain homestead, with the last light going blue on the snow of Thunder Peak, that Lenora nearly laughed. She did not laugh. She took his arm and she walked with him across the yard toward the house, and as they walked, she felt the weight of being seen by other eyes, and she lifted her head because her father had told her once that a Whitfield keeps her back straight even when the rest of her is breaking. Three children were standing on the porch. She saw the girl first. She saw the girl first because the girl was standing at the top of the steps with her arms folded across her chest and her chin tilted up at an angle that Lenora recognized from her own mirror during the worst years. The girl was perhaps 12. Her hair was the same dark chestnut as her father's, tied back with a piece of leather cord that had seen better days. Her dress was clean but worn at the elbows. Her eyes, when they met Lenora's, were the eyes of a child who had already decided the answer to every question that might be asked about her. Behind the girl stood a boy of perhaps 9, sandy-haired, thin, with a cowlick that stood up straight from the crown of his head in defiance of whatever efforts had been made against it. He was grinning. The grin was so entirely unlike the girl's composure that Lenora felt something loosen in her chest. Behind the boy, almost hidden, stood the smallest child. A boy no older than 6 with the same sandy hair as his brother, though his was longer almost to the shoulders. He was holding a rabbit made of gray cloth with one ear longer than the other. His face was pressed into the side of his sister's skirt, and only one eye was visible, looking at Lenora with an expression she could not read. "This is my daughter Grace," said Wyatt, "and my son's Josiah, we call him Joss, and Samuel, we call him Sammy." The girl said nothing. Joss spoke first. "Uncle Ezra," he said, in a voice that carried clear across the yard. "She's prettier than," the letter said. Wyatt's hand tightened slightly on Lenora's arm, and she understood it was an apology, and she was grateful for it, and she let it pass. Grace uncrossed her arms only long enough to set her hands on her hips. "The 3 others before you left inside a week," she said. "The first one lasted only 4 days. The second one cried the whole time she was here. The third one stole a saddle and ran off with a cattle drover from Butte." Grace said Wyatt, and there was warning in the word. "It's true, Pa. I know it's true. That is not the point." Grace looked at Lenora. Lenora looked back at her, and she thought about the bedroom on the 3rd floor of her aunt's house on Beacon Hill, where for 6 months she had lain awake each night listening to the grandfather clock in the hall and counting the quarter hours until dawn. She thought about the cold mutton on the servants' plates. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she had walked into her aunt's parlor and announced that she was going west, and her Aunt Prudence had laughed until she had to sit down and then had said in a voice that Lenora now believed to be the true voice of the woman, "We will see how long it takes before you come crawling back with your skirts torn and your pride gone." "I am not going to leave in a week," she said to Grace. The girl's face did not change. "We will see," Grace said. Joss bounced forward on the balls of his feet. "Can you cook, ma'am? Because Uncle Ezra does the cooking, and last week the biscuits came out so hard Sammy broke a tooth." "I did not break a tooth," Sammy said. The voice was so small and so thin and so unused that for a moment Lenora thought she had imagined it. She looked down at the little boy hiding behind his sister's skirts, and his one visible eye met hers and then disappeared again into the fabric. Grace looked at Wyatt. "He has not spoken since his mother died," Pa, she said. Wyatt's face did not move. Lenora, watching him, saw only a small thing happen at the corner of his jaw, the briefest tightening of the muscle there, and she understood that this was as close as Wyatt Blackwood came to showing the inside of himself. "Come inside," he said. "Supper is ready." The interior of the house was warmer than she had expected, and it smelled of wood smoke and old leather and something like dried sage. The main room ran the full length of the south side of the house with a stone fireplace at one end and a long table of hickory wood at the other. The kitchen opened off the back. There was a rag rug on the floor that had once been bright and was now the color of weak tea. There were 2 rocking chairs near the fire, and in one of them was a basket of mending that looked as though it had been waiting patiently for someone to come home for several years. It was a house that had lost a woman. Lenora understood that at once because her own house had lost one, and she knew the shape of the absence, and she saw it here in every corner. The curtains at the windows were clean, but hanging unevenly. A china plate on the mantel was cracked and had never been replaced. A pair of child shoes sat by the door that were a size too small for any of the children now living in the house. She took off her shawl and hung it on the peg by the door where Wyatt indicated, and she followed him to the table. Supper was elk stew and cornbread and black coffee that could have stood a spoon upright in the cup. Lenora ate slowly, aware that 3 pairs of adult eyes and 3 pairs of child's eyes were watching her eat, aware that every movement she made was being weighed against some measure she could not see. She did not speak unless she was spoken to. She did not comment on the stew, though she thought it was very good. She did not ask questions, though she had 1,000 of them. Silas had come back in at some point during the meal. He sat at the far end of the table and he did not look at her once. He ate with the efficient speed of a man who has decided that the sooner this is over, the sooner he can leave. When the plates had been cleared and the coffee refilled, Wyatt set down his cup and folded his hands on the table before him, and Lenora understood that now they were going to have the conversation. The other 3 women, he said. Yes, Lenora said. They did not stay for reasons that had less to do with them and more to do with us. I want to tell you that plainly because I will not have you discover it later and think you were lied to, she nodded. He looked at his hands, not at her. This house has been without a mother for 4 years, he said. My wife Rebecca passed in 1883. She was a fine woman. She was the center of this house, and when she went, the center went with her. My brothers and I have done what we could, but what we could was not enough. My children have suffered for it. They are suffering still. You will see it. Lenora looked at Sammy, who was pushing the last piece of cornbread around his plate without eating it. I see it already, she said. Wyatt's eyes came up for the first time and met hers, and she understood in that single glance that he had not expected her to say that so quickly. I will not speak of her more tonight, he said. Of course. The arrangement I wrote to you about still stands. You will have the upstairs bedroom. I will sleep on the settee by the fire. My brothers have the bunkhouse. We will not be husband and wife until you tell me you are certain. That may be in the spring. That may be never. The choice will be yours, and I will not ask you for it before you are ready to give it. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. In the meantime, he said, I ask only that you keep the house and that you begin as you are able to look after the children. My brothers and I will run the ranch and do the hunting and handle the heavier work. We have supplies enough for the winter. The winter itself will be the hardest thing you have ever done. I want you to know that plainly, too. I have known some hard things, Mr. Blackwood. Wyatt, he said. Wyatt. He nodded once. Then he looked at her fully for the second time, and Lenora felt something move inside her chest that she had believed to be permanently at rest, and she did not know the name for it yet, and she did not want to name it because she had learned in the last 2 years that naming things made them real and real things could be taken away. Grace came down the stairs at that moment in her nightdress, holding Sammy's hand. He wants her to read to him, Grace said, and it was not quite a demand and not quite a request. She doesn't have to. Sammy looked up at Lenora with both eyes this time. He was holding out a book. It was a book of nursery rhymes, and even from across the room, Lenora could see that it had been read 1,000 times and that it had not been opened in a long time. Lenora looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said nothing. He was letting her choose. She stood up from this table and crossed the room and knelt down so that her face was level with the child's, and she took the book in her hand and she said as gently as she had ever said anything, "What would you like me to read first, Sammy?" The little boy opened his mouth. He closed it. He pointed to a page near the beginning of the book, a page with an illustration of a hare and a tortoise, and then he buried his face against his sister's leg. Lenora read. She read the fable of the hare and the tortoise, and then she read 3 nursery rhymes, and then she read a longer piece about a boy who climbed a hill to see the sea for the first time. She read in the voice her father had used with her when she was small, the voice of a scholar who loved words and believed that children deserved to hear them well. And somewhere during the second rhyme, Sammy sat down on the floor at her feet, and somewhere during the third, he leaned his small body against her knee. And by the end of the story about the boy and the sea, Lenora realized that Joss was sitting on the floor too, and that Grace was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with her arms folded, pretending not to listen. Wyatt had not moved from his seat at the table. Ezra was watching her with the same quiet attention she had noticed in the yard, and it was not the attention of a man assessing a woman. It was the attention of a man watching something he had not expected to see. Silas was gone. She had not heard him leave. When she closed the book, Sammy was asleep with his head against her knee and his cloth rabbit pressed against his chest. Wyatt rose from the table and crossed the room and lifted the child into his arms without a word. As he passed her, his shoulder brushed hers and she felt the heat of his body through the linen of his shirt, and she understood that she had been cold for a very long time and had not known it. He carried Sammy upstairs. Grace stayed in the doorway another moment. She did not meet Lenora's eyes. She said, "There's water in the pitcher in your room and a fresh towel on the washstand. I put them there this afternoon." "Before I came," Lenora said. "Before you came," Grace said, and she turned and walked back into the kitchen. Ezra rose from the table. He took up his hat from the peg, and he paused by the door and he said, without looking at her, "The stew was fine tonight." "Ma'am." It was the first complete sentence he had spoken in her presence. He went out to the bunkhouse. Lenora sat alone in the main room for a moment with the lamp burning low and the fire settling into its long orange night, and she listened to the house. She listened to the small sounds of a family moving through its evening. Wyatt's footstep on the floorboards above as he put Sammy to bed. The creak of the stair as Grace climbed to her own room. The soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen where Joss was supposed to be wiping them and was probably not. She listened and she thought, so this is what I came to. She rose to go upstairs. She had reached the first step when she heard the horses. They were far off coming up the trail from the crossroads, and at first she thought it must be a neighbor, though Wyatt had told her in his letters that the nearest neighbor was 9 miles away at Coal Creek. She stood on the bottom step and listened, and the hoofbeats came closer, and they did not have the rhythm of a man riding alone. 2 horses moving slowly, picking their way up the trail in the dark. The front door opened before the riders had reached the yard. Wyatt came down the stairs behind her. He did not say anything. He took a rifle down from the pegs above the door, and he worked the lever with a short, hard movement that made a single metallic sound in the still house, and he stepped out onto the porch. Lenora stood in the doorway. The 2 riders came up through the gate. In the light of the lamp, Wyatt held out in his left hand, she saw that one of them was a thin man in a heavy wool coat who looked cold and miserable and not at all dangerous. The other rider was not cold and not miserable. He was a heavy-set man in a fur-lined coat that had been made by an expensive tailor somewhere 1,000 miles from Thunder Ridge. He wore a dark Stetson pulled low. He had a beard trimmed to a point, and his eyes in the lamplight were the color of river ice. "Mr. Blackwood," the heavy-set man said. His voice was warm and unhurried and entirely without honesty. "You are on my land," Wyatt said. "You will state your business and ride out." The man on the horse smiled. The smile did not reach the ice-colored eyes. "My name is Jedediah Crane," he said. "I represent the Northern Pacific Railway. I have ridden 4 days out of Rawlings Crossing to make your acquaintance, Mr. Blackwood, and to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding the valley on which you and your family are currently situated." Lenora felt Wyatt's hand come up behind her shoulder and gently, firmly move her back from the doorway into the house. But she had already seen the second thing. The thing the man Crane was carrying in his saddlebag, the corner of which was just visible in the lamplight. An envelope. A large envelope with a wax seal that she recognized because she had seen that same seal on letters in her aunt's writing desk in the house on Beacon Hill. The seal of the law firm of Ashford and Pritchett. Nathaniel Ashford's father's firm. Her Aunt Prudence had found her, and she had not come alone. Lenora took one step back into the warm yellow light of the house, and she understood with a clarity as cold and complete as the silence on Silent Mountain that the journey she thought she had finished tonight was only the first mile of a road much longer and much darker than she had yet imagined. Wyatt Blackwood stood on the porch with the rifle in his hand and the lamp in the other, and he looked at the man on the horse and he said in a voice as level as a table ride out, "Mr. Crane, Before the light fails entirely, there is nothing here that concerns you. Jedediah Crane smiled again. On the contrary, Mr. Blackwood, he said, there is a great deal here that concerns me, and you would do well, I think, to hear what I have come to say. The first snow of winter began to fall one slow flake at a time into the yellow circle of the lamplight, and inside the house, alone at the foot of the stairs, Lenora Caroline Whitfield pressed her hand to her chest, where the folded letter still lay, and she heard her own heart beating, and she thought, not yet. Do not break yet. There is work here still to be done. Jedediah Crane did not dismount. That was the first detail Lenore noticed as she stood pressed against the interior wall of the house, with only the narrow crack of the doorway between her and the man in the fur-lined coat. A man who came to a stranger's porch with good intentions dismounted. A man who came to deliver a threat remained in the saddle, so that when the words had been said, he could turn his horse without ceremony and ride away before the meaning of the words had time to settle. Crane stayed in the saddle. Mr. Blackwood, he said in that warm voice that lied with every syllable, I bring a proposition from a company of considerable resources. The Northern Pacific Railway is presently surveying a route through the Absaroka Range. The survey indicates that the most advantageous corridor for our rails passes directly through the valley on which you are currently situated. My employers are prepared to offer you $2,000 for the relocation of your family and livestock before the spring thaw. Wyatt stood on the porch with the rifle held across his forearm in a manner that was not quite aimed and not quite at rest. The lamp in his left hand threw his shadow long and broken across the frozen ground of the yard. My father died on this land, Wyatt said. My mother died on this land. My wife lies under the hickory tree at the east end of that pasture. There is no price that corresponds to those facts. You know this, Mr. Crane. A man does not ride 4 days to offer $2,000 unless he has already been told that $2,000 will not buy the thing he has come for. Crane inclined his head slightly as though conceding a point in a game of chess. A reasonable observation, he said. I am authorized to go as high as 3. Ride out. Crane did not ride out. He leaned forward on the pommel of his saddle, and in the lamplight, Lenora saw his eyes move past Wyatt's shoulder and settle on the doorway where she stood. She had not thought he could see her. She had thought the shadow was deep enough. But his eyes found her, and they held on her for the space of perhaps 2 seconds, and she understood that he had known she was there all along, and that he had been waiting for her to see him. See her. I understand, he said, still looking at her, and not at Wyatt, that you have recently acquired a member of your household. A young lady of some distinction from Boston, I believe. Wyatt's shoulders shifted a quarter inch. The rifle moved with it. An acquaintance of mine, Crane continued, a certain lady of considerable standing in the Boston community, has been most concerned about her niece's welfare. She has asked me as a professional courtesy to convey her greetings and to express her hope that the young lady might reconsider her recent choices before irrevocable harm is done to her reputation and her inheritance. Lenora felt the cold of the wall behind her through the wool of her dress. You will tell your acquaintance, Wyatt said, and his voice had gone very quiet, that the young lady in question is under the protection of this household, and that any further communication from Boston may be directed to me by post. And you will tell her further that the next man who rides up this trail on her behalf will not be offered the courtesy of turning his horse around. Crane smiled. Mr. Blackwood, he said you misunderstand. This is not an act of hostility. This is a gesture of concern from a woman of refinement who wishes only the best for her blood kin. Ride out, Mr. Crane. The next word I speak will be fired. Crane held up both gloved hands in a mocking show of surrender. He turned his horse with slow ceremony, and the thin man on the second horse turned with him, and together they rode out of the yellow circle of the lamplight. At the gate, Crane paused. He looked back over his shoulder. The snow was coming harder now, moving in slow, drifting curtains through the light. I will return in the spring, Mr. Blackwood, he called. The matter of the railroad will not go away. Neither will the matter of the lady, he rode out. The sound of the hooves faded into the timber, and Wyatt stood on the porch another full minute before he lowered the rifle. The lamp guttered in his left hand. When he finally turned and came back into the house, Lenora saw that his face had changed in some small and permanent way, and she understood that Jedediah Crane had accomplished what he had ridden 4 days to accomplish, which was not to buy the valley, but to poison it, with the knowledge that the valley could be bought and that there were people in distant cities who believed the price had already been set. Wyatt hung the rifle on its pegs. He set the lamp on the table. He did not look at her. "Who is the lady from Boston?" he said. "My aunt." He nodded slowly as though the answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. "She raised you after my father died." "Yes, and she does not wish you to be here." "She wishes," Lenora said carefully, "to inherit what my father left me. She cannot inherit it while I live unless I die without issue. And since I have been told I will never have issue, the path to her inheritance runs through my death or my return to her house. The return would be preferable, I believe, because the death would require explanation." Wyatt looked at her fully for the third time that evening. "You speak of your own death as a line item," he said. "I was taught to speak plainly of hard things," Lenora said. "My father believed it was a form of respect." He looked at her a long moment. "Your father," he said, "must have been a remarkable man." She did not answer. She could not, because her throat had closed around the grief she had been carrying for 4 years, and she was too tired tonight to fight it down a second time. Wyatt seemed to understand. He took his hat from the peg. He said, "Go up to bed, Lenora. The room at the top of the stair on the right. There is a bolt on the door. Use it if you wish. The children will not trouble you in the night. My brothers will not come in the house before morning. I will sleep by the fire." "Thank you," she said. She climbed the stairs. The bedroom was small and plain, and it had been cleaned with recent care. The bed was made up with a wool blanket and 2 quilts, and on the washstand there was a pitcher of water and a folded towel and a small sprig of dried sage tied with a piece of twine. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the sage, because she understood that Grace had placed it there deliberately, and that Grace was a girl who made a show of not caring and then left sprigs of sage on washstands for strangers. She closed the door. She did not slide the bolt. She undressed in the cold by the light of a single candle, and she washed her face in water so cold it made her gasp, and she put on the nightdress she had carried in the valise, and she climbed under the quilts and blew out the candle. And for a long while she lay in the dark and listened to the settling of the house, the pop of the fire downstairs, the faraway call of an owl somewhere on the slope of Silent Mountain, the slow, steady tick of a clock she had not noticed in the hall. Somewhere below her, Wyatt Blackwood was lying awake on a settee with a rifle on the floor beside him. Somewhere out in the barn, Silas was lying awake in a bunk. Somewhere in the timber, 4 miles south, Jedediah Crane was making camp for the night and composing in his mind the letter he would send by the next outbound post to a woman on Beacon Hill who had paid him very well to deliver a message. Lenora closed her eyes. She did not pray. She had stopped praying 2 years ago in the nave of St. Paul's Cathedral. But she said into the dark a thing that was not quite a prayer and not quite a promise. "I am going to be worth the trust of this house," she said, "whatever it costs." She slept. The first week passed in the particular slow way that weeks pass when one is learning a new world from the ground up. She rose before dawn on the second morning because she had discovered on the first morning that Ezra was already in the kitchen by the time she came down, and that Ezra cooked biscuits the way a man cooks biscuits when he has been doing it under protest for 4 years. She had said nothing to him about the biscuits. She had simply risen the next morning a full hour earlier, kindled the fire in the kitchen stove and had the dough cut, and in the oven before the first blue light was on the windows. Ezra came in at his usual hour. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her at the stove, and he looked at the row of rising biscuits on the sheet, and he looked at the coffee already perking on the back of the range. And he did a thing with his mouth that was not a smile, but was the first cousin of one. "Ma'am," he said. "Sit down," she said. "Breakfast in 10 minutes." He sat down. Wyatt came in a few minutes later, and Joss came down the stairs with his cowlick standing straight up as always. And Grace came after him in a plain brown dress with a clean white collar, and Sammy came last carrying his gray cloth rabbit by one of its uneven ears. They all sat, and Lenora put biscuits and salt pork and fried potatoes and coffee on the table, and for a moment nobody spoke. Joss tasted a biscuit. He closed his eyes. Pa, he said, his mouth full, she's staying. Grace kicked him under the table. Silas was not at breakfast. Silas Lenora had already begun to understand took his meals in the bunkhouse or not at all. By the end of the first week, she had learned the names of the horses, which was important because horses were taken seriously in this house. Judge the Mustang. Wyatt rode black with a star on his forehead. Miss Polly Ezra's brown mare, who accepted an apple from a new hand on the second day, and would therefore, Ezra said, without looking at Lenora, permit her to live. Thunder, the tall red gelding that belonged to Silas and that nobody else rode, and that Silas groomed with a care that seemed to Lenora almost like tenderness, though it was a tenderness he did not permit to extend to any creature that walked on two legs. She learned the barn, she learned the root cellar, she learned the order in which Grace expected the dishes to be wiped and placed on the shelf, which was an order that made sense only to Grace and which Lenora obeyed without comment, because she understood that Grace was not defending an order of dishes, but a way of remembering her mother. She learned most important of all the children. Joss was easy. Joss was a boy who had been starved for a gentle female voice, the way a calf is starved for milk, and he attached himself to Lenora within 3 days, with a directness that would have been embarrassing if it had not been so plainly necessary. He followed her from room to room. He asked her questions that had no answers. Ma'am, do whales get cold in winter? Ma'am, if a person died and then a tree grew out of them, would the tree taste like the person? Ma'am, do you think angels have toes? She answered each question as seriously as she could. She understood that he was not asking because he wanted answers. He was asking because he wanted to hear a woman's voice answering. Sammy was not easy. Sammy did not speak after the first night. Whatever had happened when he pointed to the illustration of the hare and the tortoise had happened once and did not repeat itself. He followed her too, but from a distance, the way a small wild thing follows a food source, keeping one doorway or one piece of furniture between them at all times. When she sat in the rocking chair by the fire in the evenings, he would arrange himself on the rag rug at a careful distance with his cloth rabbit on his lap, and he would watch her. She did not press him. She had decided the first time he hid his face in her skirts that she would treat him the way she had once been taught to approach a half-wild barn cat her father had kept in the library at home. You do not reach for such a creature. You sit still. You allow it to decide. Grace was the hardest. Grace was the hardest because Grace had decided long before Lenora had stepped down from the stagecoach at the crossroads exactly who Lenora was going to be. A temporary woman. A fourth woman. A woman who would be here until some difficulty arose, and who would then leave, and who would take with her in her leaving another small piece of the remaining belief that any woman could be counted on to stay. Lenora did not argue with Grace. She did not try to win her. She simply did the work day after day, and she let Grace see her doing it, and she let Grace make her own decisions in her own time. On the 9th morning, she found the sprig of sage on the washstand replaced with a fresh one. She did not remark on it. That was also important. On the 11th morning, Lenora found Grace at the hickory tree. She had risen early before any of the men to carry the laundry basket out to the kitchen garden, to check the lines for the day's washing, and the frost had been so heavy in the gray pre-dawn light that her footprints left dark shapes in the silver of it behind her. When she looked out past the kitchen garden toward the east pasture, she saw a small figure sitting at the base of the hickory tree, with its arms wrapped around its knees. Grace. Lenora set down the laundry basket, and she crossed the yard, and she walked through the east gate and out into the pasture, and the frozen grass crunched under her boots. And she did not call Grace's name because she understood that Grace had come out here precisely to be where no one would call her name. She stopped at a distance of 10 paces. She did not come closer. Grace did not look up. Go back inside, Grace said. Her voice was thin and steady and very tired, the voice of a child who had been awake for several hours already. I will in a moment. I do not want you out here, I know. I will not stay long. Grace pressed her forehead harder against her knees. The stone in front of her was a small, flat piece of granite, no larger than a hymnal. The name cut into it was Rebecca Blackwood, and the dates beneath the name were 1855 to 1883. Under the dates in smaller letters were the words mother and wife. Nothing else. No verse of scripture, no ornament, no lie. Lenora sat down on a stump at her own distance and waited. After a long time, Grace said without lifting her head, "You are going to leave too. They always do." "I am not going to leave. You do not know that. Nobody knows that." Ma did not think she was going to leave either. The words came out flat. They were not meant to wound. They were simply what Grace had rehearsed to herself in the long hours between 3 in the morning and first light. Lenora said my mother died of cholera when I was 8 years old. Grace did not look up, but her shoulders moved a small thing. "I do not remember very much," Lenora went on. "I remember that she smelled like lemon because she used a soap with lemon oil in it from a shop on Tremont Street. I remember that she sang a song about a sparrow, which I have been trying to remember the rest of for 15 years and I cannot. I remember that she died on a Tuesday afternoon because Tuesday was the day the post came, and my father was waiting on the porch for a letter when she called him inside, and the letter arrived in the afternoon, and my father did not read it for 3 weeks." Grace was listening now. Lenora could tell from the way the child had stopped breathing for a moment. "My father raised me alone," Lenora said. "He was a professor of Latin and Greek at Harvard College. He was not a man who knew how to raise a girl. He did the best he could. He taught me to read in 3 languages, and he taught me to keep my back straight, and he taught me that the worst thing a person can do is lie about what is plainly true. He died 4 years ago of consumption. After that, I lived with my aunt. I did not like my aunt. My aunt did not like me. I was in that house for 2 years before I came here." "What happened to you," Grace said, "before you came here?" Lenora considered what to say. She considered what not to say. She settled in the end on the truth because she had been taught that the truth was a form of respect, and because Grace deserved that respect. "I was engaged to be married," Lenora said, 3 years ago, to a man named Nathaniel Ashford. The doctor told us I could not have children. Nathaniel broke the engagement in front of 300 people in a cathedral. My aunt blamed me for it. She told me every day for 2 years that I was worth less than a field that cannot grow wheat. I began to believe her. I came here because I could not bear to die in that house, and I had nowhere else to go, and your father's letter said a thing that nobody had said to me in 3 years. What did it say? It said, 'Come if you can stay.'" Grace lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her nose was running with the cold, and she did not wipe either because wiping would have required admitting that she had been crying, and Grace Blackwood was not going to admit that to a stranger at 7 o'clock on a frostbitten October morning. Ma did not want the fourth one, Grace said. Lenora did not move. "I heard Uncle Ezra say it once," Grace continued. "He did not know I heard. He was talking to Pa in the tack room. He said Rebecca did not want this one Wyatt, and you knew it, and you wore her down. And Pa said nothing. He did not even answer. And I have carried that in me for 4 years because I did not know what to do with it. I did not know whether to be angry at Pa for wanting another baby, or at Ma for dying, or at myself for not loving the baby enough to make it want to live." Grace's voice broke on the last word. Lenora stood up from the stump. She did not cross the 10 paces. She waited because she had not been given permission. Grace looked at her. "I have not cried about it," Grace said. "Not once, because if I cry, Joss will cry, and Sammy will cry, and Pa will not be able to bear it. And I have been the one who does not cry because somebody has to be that one in this house." "I know," Lenora said. "No, you do not know. Not yet." "I think perhaps I do, Grace. I had to be that one too. For my father, in the last year of his life." Grace considered this a long time. Then she held out her hand. Lenora crossed the 10 paces and she sat down in the frost beside Grace, and she took the small, cold hand in her own, and Grace turned her face into Lenora's shoulder, and for perhaps 7 minutes a 12-year-old girl who had not cried about her mother in 4 years cried as though something that had been damned in her was at last permitted to run. Lenora did not speak. She had been cried on before. She knew that words were what you offered afterward, if at all. When Grace was finished, she sat up and she wiped her nose on the back of her own sleeve, and she said in a voice that was almost steady, "You are not my mother. I know. I do not want you to be. I know, Grace, I'm not asking to be. But you can stay," Grace said. "If you still want to, after knowing about Ma, you can stay." "Yes," Lenora said, "I can still stay." They walked back to the house together. At the east gate, Grace stopped and turned and looked up at Lenora with a face that was red from cold and salt and something that was almost but not quite relief. "Do not tell Pa," Grace said. "About what I told you, about what Uncle Ezra said, I will not. Promise, I promise." Grace nodded once. She went ahead across the yard and into the kitchen to begin the breakfast. She had not yet begun, and Lenora picked up the laundry basket from where she had left it at the edge of the kitchen garden. And by the time the first pale light reached the chimney tops of Thunder Ridge, the two of them were working side by side at the stove, not speaking, and Ezra came in and saw them there, and something in his face changed in a way Lenora did not see, and Grace did not see, but that Ezra would carry with him all the way out to the hay that morning. The tour of the property came the next day, when the weather held clear and cold, and the first heavy snows had not yet come. Ezra gave her the tour because Wyatt was riding fence that day, and Silas was in the bunkhouse shoeing Thunder. Ezra did not speak much at first. He walked beside her along the south fence, his long stride shortened to match hers, and he pointed with his chin at things that required pointing at. The root cellar, the smokehouse where hams and sides of elk hung in the cold dark, the chicken coop which Grace tended, the spring house over the small creek that came down from Silent Mountain where in warmer months they kept the milk and butter cool. This house, he said at last when they were standing at the corner of the property looking out toward Thunder Peak, was put up in the year 1870. Wyatt was 17 then. I was 14. Silas was 11. You built it yourselves. We built it ourselves, with no help. Our father was killed trapping above Yellowstone in 1867. Our mother took the pneumonia the following winter. There was an aunt in St. Louis who sent money for a year and then stopped. Wyatt was 14 when we buried our mother. He ran this place for 2 years before we put up the house. We lived in the sod dugout down by the creek. You can see where it was. The depression in the ground there, he pointed. She saw it, a slight hollow in the earth now grown over with grass. The house was built with our own hands, he said. Every board, every nail, every stone in those chimneys. When Wyatt married Rebecca in 1874, he added the upstairs. When Grace was born, he added the second chimney. When Joss was born, he added the porch. When Sammy was born, he would have added a second room upstairs. But then Rebecca took sick with the last one and we did not finish it. Lenore was quiet. "Built with our own hands," Ezra said again softly, as though the phrase were a prayer that he had spoken often enough that it had worn smooth. She would hear that phrase many times before the winter was over. She would come to understand slowly that it was the deepest thing a Blackwood man could say about a thing. Built with our own hands. It was the answer to every question about why they were here, why they had stayed, why $3,000 from a railroad was not a number that required consideration. They walked back toward the house in silence. At the gate, Ezra stopped. "Ma'am," he said without looking at her. "Lenora," she said. "Please." "Lenora, my brother does not speak easily. About my sister-in-law, about Rebecca, I understand. I do not think you do. Not yet. But I am asking you to be patient with him. He lost more than a wife. He lost his own sense of what kind of man he is. A man who believes he failed his wife is a hard thing to put back together. The pieces do not fit the way they used to. I will be patient, Ezra." He looked at her then, directly, for perhaps the second time in her life. "I believe you will," he said. He walked on toward the barn. The fifth day of the second week was the day that Sammy climbed the hickory tree. It was the hickory tree at the east end of the pasture, the same tree under which Rebecca lay. By now, Lenora knew without being told which tree it was, and why Grace would not go near it, and why Wyatt rode past it each morning with his face turned carefully toward the north, and why Ezra, when he passed it, sometimes touched the brim of his hat in a small, unconscious gesture that he did not seem to know he was making. On the fifth day of the second week, at about the hour of 3 in the afternoon, Joss came running into the kitchen where Lenore was putting up the last of the pumpkin into jars for the winter. His face was the color of chalk. "Miss Lenora," he said, and his voice had gone up a full octave. "Sammy's up the hickory tree and he can't come down." She went. She went without putting on her shawl. She went without stopping to push back the strand of hair that had fallen across her face. She went at a dead run across the yard and through the south gate and out across the brown, frozen grass of the pasture, and Joss came behind her, and Grace was already there at the base of the tree, with her head thrown back and her hands pressed against her mouth. Sammy was 20 feet up. He was on a limb no thicker than a man's wrist, and the limb was bending under his weight in a slow, patient way that Lenora understood at once. The gray cloth rabbit was on the ground at the foot of the tree. He had been trying to get it down. He had been climbing for something, and the something had fallen, and now he was 20 feet up a tree he did not know how to come down from. He was not crying. That was the worst thing. He was not crying. He was simply clinging to the trunk with both arms, his small face pressed against the bark, his eyes closed. "Pause up the north draw," Grace said. "Uncle Ezra's hunting. Uncle Silas is on the ridge checking the strays." "How long?" Lenora said. 4 minutes? Maybe 5. The limb would break in 10. Lenora looked down at her dress. It was the navy blue traveling dress she had worn from Boston. The only good dress she owned. She had put it on that morning because she had washed the others, and it was the only thing clean. She reached behind her and began to unfasten the buttons. "Grace," said Miss Lenora. "Help me get out of the overskirt," Lenora said. "Wait, I cannot climb in it." Grace helped her. Grace's hands were steady. Grace did not ask questions. Between them and perhaps 30 seconds, they had the heavy overskirt of the navy dress laid over a low branch of a neighboring tree, and Lenora stood in the underskirt, in the corset, in the long-sleeve bodice, and she looked up at the tree, and she looked at her hands, and she thought about the library at home, and she thought about the Latin she had read aloud to her father when she was 12, and she thought my father would climb this tree. She began to climb. She had not climbed a tree in her life, not once. Her education had not included trees. But the hickory was an old tree with low limbs set close together near the trunk, and she understood after the first 6 feet of climbing that climbing was simply a matter of keeping your weight close to the center of the tree and not looking down, and she did not look down, and she climbed. Her hands began to bleed almost at once. The bark of a hickory tree is not kind to a hand that has only ever held a book or a needle. She did not stop. She climbed past the first fork and the second, and she heard the limb under Sammy creak once with a dry sound, and she climbed faster. When she reached him, she did not speak. She put one arm around the trunk, and she reached the other around his small body, and she said into his ear very softly, "I have you. I have you now. You can let go." He did not let go. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. He whispered, 4 years of silence breaking open in a single breath. "Sui, you smell like bread." She began to cry. She did not mean to. She could not help it. "My mother used to smell like bread," he said. "I know," she said, though she did not know. "I know, Sammy. It's all right. Put your arms around my neck." "That's it. Hold on. We are going down now. We are going down together." She climbed down with him. It was harder going down than going up because she could no longer use both hands, and because the weight of the child pulled her forward, and because the light was failing, and because the strand of hair that had fallen across her face had now fallen across both her eyes, and she could not see past it. She climbed down anyway, limb by limb, the small body clinging to her neck, and when her feet touched the frozen grass of the pasture, she fell to her knees, and Grace was there, and Joss was there, and they all wrapped around each other without knowing who was holding whom. Silas was at the gate. She did not see him at first. She saw him only when she looked up past Grace's shoulder and noticed that a man was standing perfectly still at the gate of the pasture, and that the man was holding the reins of the red horse, and that the man was Silas. He was watching her. His face was a thing she could not read. It was not anger. It was not mockery. It was something like the expression of a man who has been told a truth he did not want to hear and is now required to carry it. He turned his horse. He rode into the barn. He did not come out for the rest of the afternoon. That night, after Sammy had been put to bed with the gray cloth rabbit tucked under his chin, after Grace had silently brought a basin of warm water and iodine onto the kitchen, and had cleaned and bandaged Lenora's torn hands without speaking a single word after Wyatt had come home from the North Draw, and had listened to the story from Joss in a silence so complete that Lenora had wondered if he would ever speak again after supper had been eaten, and the plates cleared, and the children sent upstairs. Lenora sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. She heard voices through the back wall of the kitchen. The back wall of the kitchen was the front wall of the barn. She had not realized this before. The two buildings had been set close together for warmth, and on a still cold night, the sound of a voice in the tack room of the barn carried through the log wall into the kitchen as clearly as if the speaker had been in the next room. The voices were Ezra and Silas. Lenora did not move from her chair. She did not get up. She did not put her hands over her ears. She understood in the way one sometimes understands things without deciding them, that she was meant to hear this, that some part of her had sat down at the kitchen table at this hour because she had known without knowing that these two brothers always had their hard conversations in the tack room after supper, and that tonight they were going to have one about her. Wyatt cannot keep hiding it from her, Ezra said. He can for now, Silas said. He cannot keep hiding it forever. If she stays, she will know. She is not a fool. She sees his house. She sees him. She will not stay long enough to know. A long pause. You keep saying that, Ezra said. You have been saying it for 12 days. When are you going to stop saying it? When she leaves, she is not going to leave Silas. Another pause. Longer this time. Today, Ezra said, today she climbed the hickory tree, in a corset, with her hands bleeding, for a child who was not hers, a child who had not spoken since his mother died. And she brought him down, and she did not cry for her own hands, she cried because he told her she smelled like his mother. And you stood at the gate for 7 full minutes after she came down, and you did not move. Do not tell me you did not see it. I saw it. What did you see? Silas did not answer for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different. It was lower and it was rougher, and it had lost the hard, bright edge it always had when he spoke about anything at all. I saw a woman, he said, who does not belong in this country, doing a thing this country would not have asked her to do, and doing it anyway. Because a child needed it. Yes. I was wrong about her, Ezra. Yes. Silas made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost not. What do I do with that? He said. You tell her, Ezra said. When the time comes, you tell her that you were wrong. That is what a man does, Silas. That is all there is to it. Another long pause. Wyatt is going to have to tell her about Rebecca, Silas said. He cannot marry her without telling her. And he is going to marry her, Ezra. You know he is. Anyone with eyes in his head can see it. I know he is. If she leaves when he tells her, it will kill him. She will not leave Silas. How do you know that? Because Ezra said I was watching her face tonight when Sammy told her she smelled like his mother. And I have seen that face before. I saw it on the face of our own mother the day she buried our father. It is the face of a woman who has decided. You cannot shake a woman like that loose. God himself cannot shake a woman like that loose. The sound of a bridle being hung on a peg. The sound of a stall door closing. The two brothers were finished speaking. Lenora sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she looked down at her bandaged hands, and she understood with a quietness that surprised her that she had been accepted by the Blackwood brothers sometime in the last 12 days without her noticing, and that she had been accepted in a way that her Aunt Prudence would never in 100 lifetimes on Beacon Hill be able to accept her. She had been accepted not for the Whitfield name, not for the inheritance that had been the engine of every courtship of her young womanhood, not for her education or her manners or the arrangement of her hair. She had been accepted because she had climbed a tree, because a child had told her she smelled like bread, because she had decided. Wyatt came down the stairs behind her. She did not turn. She heard his footstep. She heard him stop in the doorway of the kitchen. She heard him cross the room and pull out the chair opposite her and sit down slowly the way a man sits when he knows the next 10 minutes of his life are going to require something of him that he has been putting off for a long time. Lenore, he said, yes, there is a thing I have to tell you about Rebecca, about how she died. It is not what the children have been told. It is not what the town has been told. It is the truth, and you have a right to know it, and I should have told you before tonight. She lifted her eyes and looked at him. Wyatt, she said, I know already. I heard. His face did not move. How long? Perhaps 4 minutes. He closed his eyes, only for a moment. When he opened them, he was looking at the surface of the kitchen table, not at her. Then you know, he said, I know enough. Say it then. Say it aloud. Because I have not said it aloud to another human being outside of my brothers since the day it happened, and I need to know that it can be said in this house without the roof coming down. She set her bandaged hand very gently on top of his hand where it lay on the table. Your wife took her own life, she said, after the last child was lost. You found her. You have carried it for 4 years. The children do not know. The town does not know. And you have been waiting, I think, for someone who could hear it without being broken by it. Wyatt did not cry. He did not cry, but he put his other hand over hers, and he pressed it there against the wood of the table, as though he were holding on to something in a hard current, and he sat like that for a long time without speaking. And Lenora did not speak either, because there were no words in any of her father's books for this, and she understood that the only right thing to do was to be a weight that did not move until the current had passed. After a while, he said, You are not going to leave. No. Not when spring comes. No. Not ever. Not ever, she said. He turned his hand under hers and closed his fingers around her bandaged palm. You are home now, Lenore, he said. She closed her eyes. Outside, the first heavy snow of the winter began to fall on Thunder Ridge. It came down slowly at first and then faster. And by morning, the fence posts would be capped in white, and the trail down to the crossroads would be gone beneath 2 feet of drift, and the valley would be cut off from the rest of the world for the first time that winter. Inside the house at the kitchen table, 2 people who had each arrived in this life carrying a grief they had believed to be unbearable, sat with their hands folded together in the yellow light of a lamp. And they did not speak any further because there was nothing further that needed to be said. Tonight, in the barn, Silas Blackwood sat on an upturned crate and stared at the floor and tried to understand what had happened to him in the 12 days since a woman in a navy traveling dresses had stepped down at the crossroads with a shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. In an upstairs bedroom, a boy of 6 slept with a gray cloth rabbit pressed against his chest, and for the first time in 4 long years, he did not wake in the middle of the night, calling for a mother who was not coming. And somewhere 4 days east of Thunder Ridge, in a telegraph office in Rawlings Crossing, a thin man in a heavy wool coat was handing a folded message across the counter to be transmitted to a lawyer's office in Boston, Massachusetts. The message was short. She is installed. The household is defensive. Recommend escalation by spring. Crane. The telegrapher tapped it out in Morse code, and the words traveled east along the copper wire through the cold mountain night, and the winter closed down over Thunder Ridge, and the long, hard, slow work of trust began. The winter settled in the way winter settles in the high country, not as weather, but as presence. By the third week of November, the snow stood 4 feet deep against the north wall of the barn, and the trail down to the crossroads existed only as a memory that certain trees remembered and certain stones did not. The cold came in two kinds. There was the daytime cold, which had edges and could be worked through with wool and steady labor, and there was the nighttime cold, which had no edges at all and simply laid itself over the valley like a hand laid over the mouth of a sleeping child, patient and complete. Lenora learned both kinds. She learned them the way a person learns a new language word by word, day by day, until she no longer thought about the grammar of it. She learned that you did not go out to the necessary house after dark without carrying a coal from the fire in a tin pail, because a frostbitten hand could not work a latch. She learned that the water in the pitcher on her washstand would freeze solid by 4 in the morning unless she set it on the floor near the warmth of the chimney. She learned that a wool sock worn over a cotton sock was worth more than a pair of city boots. She learned that Grace knew how to mend a wool sock with a stitch that did not leave a ridge to rub a blister, and that Grace had learned this stitch from her mother, and that when Lenora asked Grace to show her the stitch, Grace had shown her wordlessly and had then left the room quickly as though she had been caught doing something she had not meant to do. The rhythm of the house settled into the rhythm of the season. Wyatt was up before first light each morning to see to the stock. Ezra came in from the bunkhouse at 5:30 and had coffee with Lenora in the kitchen and then went out with Wyatt to the hay. Silas came in last, and only when the breakfast was on the table, and he still did not speak to her directly, but he no longer looked through her either. He looked at her, not for long, a glance across the biscuits, a nod when she refilled his cup. Small things, the smallest things. But she noticed that he no longer took his plate back to the bunkhouse, and that by the end of the third week he had begun to sit in the chair opposite hers at supper, and that one evening in the fourth week he cleared his own plate from the table and carried it to the kitchen and set it in the wash basin without being asked. She did not remark on it. She was learning this winter when to remark and when to let a thing pass. On a Tuesday in the fourth week, Silas came to her in the kitchen after breakfast and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. He did not sit. He did not come all the way in. "Ma'am," he said. "Lenora. Lenora. Ezra said you asked him whether you might learn to shoot." "I did. He said I should speak to you." Silas turned the hat slowly between his large brown hands. He was looking at the floor. "A woman in this country who cannot handle a rifle," he said, "is a liability to the men who love her. I will teach you, after dinner, if you have no objection." "I have no objection. I will not be gentle about it. I do not require you to be gentle." He looked up at her. For the first time in 4 weeks, he looked her directly in the face. His eyes were the color of dark whiskey, and his face had the closed, hard expression it always had. But something in it had shifted in a way Lenora could not name, and she understood that he was not offering to teach her to shoot out of charity or even out of practicality. He was offering something else, and the something else was an apology for which he did not yet have words. She nodded. "After dinner, then," she said. He set the hat on his head and went out. He taught her that afternoon behind the barn with a Winchester 1873 leaning against a hay bale and a row of tin cans set out at 50 yards along the top of a stone wall. He did not speak more than was necessary. He showed her how to check the magazine. He showed her how to seat the stock against her shoulder, not her upper arm, which had been her instinct, and he corrected the instinct without laughing at it, which she had expected him to do. He showed her the trigger pull, and he told her to breathe out halfway and hold, and when she fired for the first time and the rifle kicked her back half a step in the snow, he steadied her with one hand against her elbow and then removed the hand at once. She missed the first 3 cans. She hit the 4th. She hit the 5th and the 6th. And when she hit the 7th, the can leapt into the cold blue air and fell into the snowbank with a small metallic sound of defeat. And Silas said very quietly behind her, "That will do, Lenora." It was the first time he had used her name without her first asking him to. She did not turn to look at him because she understood that he had not meant to say it, and that turning would embarrass him, and that an embarrassed Silas Blackwood might retreat for another 4 weeks. She simply lowered the rifle and worked the lever the way he had taught her and said again, "Please." He set another line of cans. When those were gone too, he walked up behind her and took the rifle from her hands and checked the magazine out of habit and leaned it against the stone wall, and he stood with his back to her, looking out toward Thunder Peak for a long while before he spoke. "Everything on this place was built with our own hands," he said. "The house, the barn, the fences that are still standing, the cradles 3 children slept in, the coffin my sister-in-law is buried in. I made that coffin, Lenora. It is under the hickory tree where you saw it. Wyatt could not do it. I did it for him." She did not turn. "I am telling you this," Lila said, "because I want you to understand what you are stepping into. This place is not a building. It is the work of 20 years of 3 men. When my brother offered you the use of my mother's ring, he was offering you a share of that work. I was not in favor of it for a long time. I wanted you to know that too, because I am not a man who hides what I have thought. But I am telling you now that I was wrong, and I am asking your pardon, Lenora, for the manner in which I received you the day you arrived." "You have my pardon, Silas." "Thank you." He turned and picked up the rifle, and they walked back to the barn together in a silence that was different now from any silence that had passed between them before. She was by the end of that first afternoon a passable shot at 50 yards. By the end of the second week of practice, she was better than Joss, who had been shooting since he was 7 and who was offended about it. By the end of the third week, she could put 5 out of 6 into a moving target the size of a coffee tin at 75 yards. And Ezra, who had come out to watch on the last afternoon, said to Silas in a voice that Lenora was not supposed to hear, "She will do. She will do." Silas agreed. The days went on. She learned to salt and hang elk meat in the smokehouse with Ezra, who talked more when his hands were busy and when he was not being looked at. She learned over those quiet afternoons among the hanging flanks of winter venison the name of every neighbor within 50 miles. She learned that the schoolmaster at Rawlings Crossing had once been a professor of classical languages at a college in Illinois before a scandal whose nature Ezra declined to describe. She learned that the woman who kept the post office was the widow of a cavalry lieutenant and that she had raised her 4 sons alone and had sent all 4 to the university at Laramie. She learned that Ezra had been at the age of 19 in love with a girl in Rawlings Crossing named Cordelia Jenkins, and that he had not spoken of this love to the girl in question, and that the girl was still in Rawlings Crossing and was still unmarried, and that Ezra had not been to town in 2 years. He told her these things while he worked a knife along a backstrap. She did not ask him why he had stopped going to town. He told her anyway on the last afternoon of the smokehouse work. "It is difficult," he said, "to court a woman properly when your sister-in-law has taken her own life, and the whole town has half-guessed the truth and is waiting to see if your brother will break. A man cannot leave his brother at a time like that, and once you have not left, you find that the years have passed and the girl has grown up, and you do not know what you would even say to her now. You might say hello," Lenora said. He looked at her sidelong. "You might," he said slowly at that. The matter was not mentioned again between them that winter. But in the spring, when the roads opened, Ezra rode to Rawlings Crossing on a matter of salt and flour, and he was gone 4 days instead of 2, and when he came back, he was whistling, and Cordelia Jenkins began within the month to send letters to Thunder Ridge in a careful schoolgirl hand. But that was spring. In the 4th week of November, it was still winter, and the hardest days were still ahead. The hardest days came on a Thursday in the 2nd week of December. The morning had been clear. That was what Lenora would remember afterward, that the morning had been unnaturally clear, a blue so cold and so high that it hurt the back of the throat to breathe it. Wyatt rode out before dawn with Judge bound for Rawlings Crossing. Sammy had begun to cough 2 nights before. Grace had listened to the child's chest with her ear pressed to his back and had straightened slowly, and Grace's face when she straightened had been a face that Lenora did not want to see ever again on a 12-year-old girl, because it was the face of a girl who had heard this particular wet rattle in the lungs of another child once before and had watched that child die of it. Pneumonia, Grace had said. Wyatt was riding for the doctor. Ezra had ridden out at the same hour bound for the West Draw, where two of the cows had gone missing in the night and were presumed calving in some gully that would kill them by evening if the cows were not brought in. Silas had gone out on foot toward the south fence with a bundle of wire and a post-hole iron because a section of the fence had given way in the snow, and the cattle on the upper pasture were drifting. Lenora was in the house with the three children. The storm came out of the north at about 11 o'clock in the morning. She heard it before she saw it. She was at the stove making broth for Sammy when the wind changed. A wind that had been a steady, low whisper from the southwest all morning turned in the space of perhaps 30 seconds into a deeper and harder voice from due north, and the sound of it moved through the valley like a door closing on a long hallway. She went to the window over the kitchen sink and looked out, and she watched the storm come over the shoulder of Thunder Peak in a single rolling gray wall, and she understood in the same moment that the men were out in it and that the men would not be able to come home until it passed, and that it was not going to pass quickly. Within 15 minutes, she could no longer see the barn. Within half an hour, she could no longer see the hickory tree at the east end of the pasture, which was closer than the barn. Sammy's fever rose. She took it first at noon with the back of her hand against his forehead, and the forehead was warm, but not terrible. She took it at 1, and it was worse. She took it at 2, and it was worse still. By 3 in the afternoon, the little boy was drifting in and out of a light, troubled sleep, and his breathing had gone to a thin whistle in the top of his chest. And Grace, who had been sitting beside the bed since morning, looked at Lenora with an expression that Lenora had seen once before in the eyes of her own father in the last week of his life. "It is the same," Grace said. "It is the same as the baby had, the one that came before Sammy, the one that did not live." Lenora sat down on the edge of the bed. "Grace," she said. Grace did not look at her. "Grace," Lenora said again, "your father will come back. He will bring the doctor. We only need to keep him warm and keep him breathing until they come." "The storm will not let them through," Grace said. "The storm will pass. The storm will not pass in time." Lenora took Grace's hand very gently and held it. "Listen to me," she said. "Your father is the most stubborn man I have ever met in my life, and I grew up in a house with my father who was very stubborn. A blizzard is not what will stop Wyatt Blackwood. He will come. Do you understand me? He will come." Grace nodded. She did not look convinced, but she nodded. They did what there was to do. Lenora kept the fire high. She set water to boil on the stove and kept the kitchen air moist with steam. She wrapped Sammy in a clean cotton sheet, cooled in snow, when the fever climbed, and she wrapped him in dry wool when the fever fell, and she alternated these two acts through the afternoon the way a sailor trims a sail against a shifting wind. Joss, who had been crying silently in the corner of the bedroom for most of an hour, was given a task. His task was to sit at the window of the main room downstairs and to watch the yard and to tell Lenora the moment he saw a rider coming through the gate. He sat. He watched. It was just past 4 in the afternoon when the first sound came from the barn. Lenora heard it through the wall of the kitchen because the back wall of the kitchen was the front wall of the barn, and she had been listening to the sounds of that barn for nearly 2 months now, and she knew what sounds belonged there and what sounds did not. A stall door opening belonged. A horse shifting his weight belonged. A cat moving in the rafters belonged. The sound of a human voice cursing softly in a voice she did not know did not belong. She stood still in the kitchen with a pot of water in her hands. "Grace," she called up the stairs. "Yes, stay with Sammy. Bolt the door at the top of the stair. Do not come down until I call you." Grace's footsteps moved across the bedroom floor above, and the bolt slid, and Lenora set the pot of water down on the stove and crossed to the pegs by the front door where the Winchester hung. She took it down. She checked the magazine the way Silas had taught her. She set the stock against her shoulder, not her upper arm. She went out the back door of the house into the breezeway that led to the barn. The breezeway was a narrow roof passage built for exactly this kind of weather, so that a woman would not have to go out into an open yard in a storm to fetch an egg or a bucket of milk. It was dark inside it, and the wind found the cracks in the boards and whistled through them in long, thin voices. She moved down the breezeway with the rifle raised and her breath coming quick and even through her nose. At the door into the barn, she stopped. She listened. Two voices, male, low. One of them said the black Mustang is Blackwood's own. We turned that one out first, and it will not come back. Without a mount, the man cannot reach his family. The other voice said the red one also. The red one belongs to the younger brother. She understood in a single clean instant what was being attempted. They were going to open the stalls and drive the horses out the main doors of the barn into the blizzard. The horses would not survive more than 2 hours in that storm. The men of the house, when they returned, would be on foot if they returned at all, and a man on foot in this country, in this weather, was a dead man. Jedediah Crane had sent his message in October, and the message had been escalation by spring, and this was the beginning of that escalation, now 5 months early, while the three Blackwood brothers were each scattered in different directions on a day that had opened clear and turned bad. Lenora stepped into the barn. She stepped in at the side door by the tack room, which meant she was behind the two men and they had not heard her over the wind. She raised the rifle. "Hands off that stall," she said. Her voice was steady. She heard it as though it belonged to someone else. A woman she did not know calmly addressing a pair of men she could not see clearly in the half-dark of the lantern light at the far end of the barn. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this as an interesting fact and then set it aside. The two men turned. One of them was holding a length of rope. The other had his hand on the latch of Judge's stall. They were both dressed for weather with their hat brims pulled low and scarves across the lower part of their faces. But she could see their eyes in the lantern light, and the eyes were the eyes of men who had not expected to meet a woman with a rifle in the back of a Blackwood barn during the worst storm of the winter. The one with the rope laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh. "Lady," he said, "you don't know how to shoot that thing. I know how," she said. "You ain't gonna fire it. Lady like you ain't gonna fire it on a man." She fired it on the wall between them. The bullet went into a timber 6 inches from the head of the man with the rope, and splinters of seasoned hickory exploded outward in a pale fan, and the man with the rope went down flat on the straw of the barn floor, with his hands over his head, and the other man let go of the stall latch and stepped backward, 3 quick steps with his hands held up at the level of his shoulders. Lenora worked the lever. The spent cartridge spun out and hit the floor with a small, bright ring. "The next one," she said, "will not miss." The man with his hands up said, "Ma'am, please." "Out," she said. "Out the main door. Leave the rope. Leave whatever you carried in here. You will go on foot, both of you, and you will tell Mr. Crane that the Blackwood barn is not available to him, and that the next time a man of his crosses that gate, he will not walk out of it. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Go." They went. The one on the floor scrambled up, and neither of them looked back, and they went out the main doors of the barn into the white roaring wall of the storm, and Lenora followed them as far as the doors and watched until she could no longer see them, and then she closed the doors and barred them and leaned her forehead for one moment against the cold, rough wood. The horses were still in their stalls, Judge, Miss Polly, Thunder, the 4 others, all of them. She went back inside. She climbed the stairs. She told Grace through the door that it was all right and that Grace could open the bolt, and Grace did. Grace looked at her. Grace looked at the rifle. Grace did not ask. Sammy was worse. Lenora sat by the bed another 2 hours, and the storm did not break, and Sammy's breathing went thinner and thinner, and Joss came in from his post at the window and climbed into the bed next to his brother without being told to, and pressed his small body against Sammy's small body to share heat. And Grace took the place at the head of the bed and put her hand on Sammy's forehead and began very softly to sing. She sang a song Lenora had never heard, A slow song in a minor key about a boat on a river and a man who was not coming home. Lenora understood that it was a song their mother had sung. She did not join in. She had not been given the song. She sat at the foot of the bed and she put her hand on the child's ankle over the blanket and she waited. The door of the house banged open at 5 minutes past 6. She heard it all the way up the stairs. She heard the wind come in with it in a long roar, and she heard a man's voice saying a word she could not make out, and she was on her feet and halfway down the stairs before she realized she had moved. Wyatt was in the main room. He was alone. No doctor. His coat was sheeted with ice. His beard was white. His hat was gone lost somewhere in the storm, and his hair had frozen in flat dark plaits against his skull. In his right hand he held a small brown paper parcel that was partly crusted with snow. In his left he held nothing because his left hand was clenched in a fist against his own chest as though he were holding a wound. He looked at her. "Sammy," he said. "Alive," she said. "Worse. Come up." He came up. He climbed the stairs one at a time, slow, the way a man climbs stairs when every muscle in his body has been used up. And when he reached the bedroom, he crossed to the bed and dropped to his knees beside it. And he opened the parcel with a hands that would not obey him. And inside the parcel was a small glass bottle of quinine powder that he had ridden 40 miles through a blizzard to bring home. He gave it to Lenora. He did not say anything. He did not have to. She mixed the powder with water and honey on a teaspoon, and she held the back of Sammy's head in her hand, and she worked the spoon between its cracked lips, one careful measure at a time, and the child swallowed and coughed and swallowed again, and after a long while his breathing changed. It did not become easy, but it became different, a little deeper, a little slower. Wyatt sat on the floor with his back against the side of the bed. He had his eyes closed. His left hand was still clenched against his chest, and Lenora understood now that the hand was injured, that the skin on the knuckles had split from cold and effort somewhere during the ride, and that he had not even thought about it until he had put the bottle in her hand. She took his hand. She took it in both of hers gently, and she opened the fist finger by finger, and she cleaned the broken knuckles with warm water from the pitcher, and she bound them with a strip of linen from her own petticoat, and he watched her do it without speaking, and Grace watched from the head of the bed, and Joss watched from the foot, and Sammy slept. When it was done, Wyatt said very quietly, "I could not get the doctor. The pass is closed. I could only get the quinine. The apothecary was closing his shop when I reached him. He gave it to me and refused payment and told me to go." "You brought it," Lenore said. "That is all that was needed. Men came here." She did not hide it from him. 2 men, sent by Crane. They tried to turn the horses out into the storm. I stopped them. "How did you stop them, Lenora?" "I fired the rifle once, into a timber between them. They left." Wyatt opened his eyes and looked at her. "You fired the rifle?" "Yes." "At men. I fired between them. It was enough." He closed his eyes again. His jaw worked. He said after a long silence, "Lenora, yes. I am going to say a thing. I am going to say it now because I nearly did not come home tonight, and I have learned this winter that a man who does not say the thing when he has the breath to say it is a fool who deserves what comes to him." She waited. "I did not ride through that storm for the quinine," he said. "I rode through it because I could not bear the thought of you being alone in this house if something went wrong. The quinine was an excuse. It was a reason I could give my hands to keep them moving. The truth is that I would have ridden through that storm for nothing at all, except that you were here, and that the children were here, and that this house has become in 2 months the only place in the world I can stand to be." She did not answer with words. She crossed the small space between them, and she sat down on the floor beside him, and she put her forehead against the cold, wet cloth of his coat over his chest, and his uninjured arm came up slowly and closed around her shoulders. And for a long time, neither of them said anything more, and the storm howled against the shingles above them, and the child slept, and Grace and Joss, at the head and foot of the bed, did not look at each other, and did not look at the 2 adults on the floor, because they understood as children sometimes understand without being told that something had just happened that would hold. Downstairs, the front door opened a second time. Ezra came in bloodied across one hand from an accident with a half-frozen calf, with two small, wet, newborn calves slung across the front of his saddle, and the mother cow stumbling behind him in the wind. He had brought them home through 2 miles of whiteout by following the line of his own fence with one hand, because he could not see the ground in front of his horse. Silas came in an hour later. He came in on foot. The south fence was mended, the cattle were brought back to the home pasture, and he had walked the last mile because Thunder had stepped into a drift too deep for the horse and had cut a tendon on a piece of buried wire, and Silas would not leave a crippled horse in the storm. He had bound the leg with his own belt and had walked the horse home at this pace the horse could walk, which was slow, and the walking of it had cost Silas the feeling in 2 fingers of his right hand, which would come back, and the feeling in the smallest toe of his left foot, which would not. All 3 brothers were in the house by 7 o'clock. All 3 brothers were alive. The storm broke at midnight. It broke the way such storms break in the mountains all at once, the wind falling away in a single exhaled breath, the snow ceasing, the clouds parting, and the whole white ruined yard of Thunder Ridge lying silent under a sky that had cracked open and spilled stars across itself in a crowd so vast and cold and bright that Lenora, stepping out onto the front porch to breathe air that did not smell of fever and lamp oil, stopped in the doorway and forgot for a moment what she had come outside to do. Wyatt came out behind her. He was wrapped in a blanket. His hand was freshly rebandaged. Ezra had set it over supper. He stood beside her on the porch, and neither of them spoke for a long while. Then he said, "Lenora." Yes. He reached into the pocket of the coat hanging from the peg behind him, and he took something out and he held it in his palm, and she saw in the thin, bright starlight that it was a plain gold ring that had been in his family a long time. "This was my mother's," he said. "She left it to Rebecca. Rebecca left it to whichever of us should need it next," which we took to mean the next brother who married. "I have carried it in my pocket for 11 days, Lenora. I have been trying to find the right hour to offer it to you. I do not think there is going to be a righter hour than this one." He held the ring between his bandaged thumb and his forefinger in the starlight. "I have nothing to offer you, Lenora," he said, "but this valley and what we built with our own hands. Will you have it?" She took the ring from his hand. She did not put it on. She folded her hand around it, and she held it against her chest, and she turned to face him on the porch, and she said in a voice that was entirely steady, because she had decided long ago on a train somewhere between Chicago and Cheyenne, that if this moment ever came, she would meet it without flinching. "Wyatt Blackwood, I will have you. Not because you asked tonight, because I decided the morning Sammy told me I smelled like bread, that wherever this house went from now on was the only place I had any further interest in going." He did not answer with words either. He leaned down, and under the star-filled sky of a valley that had just come through the worst storm of the decade, he kissed her once, briefly, with the kind of kiss a man gives a woman when he is promising her the rest of his life and does not yet wish to spend any of it in extravagance. They went back inside. Inside the main room by the fire, Ezra was already asleep in one of the 2 rocking chairs. Silas was awake. He had been watching the fire. When they came in, he looked up and he saw the ring in Lenora's hand, and he saw her face and he saw his brother's face, and he stood up from the hearth without speaking, and he crossed the room and he did a thing Lenora would remember to the end of her life. He took her free hand in both of his. "Sister," he said. It was the first time he had used the word. He said nothing else. He let go of her hand. He went back to the fire. But in the morning, when the valley lay bright and blinding under a new sun, a sealed envelope was nailed to the front gate post in the pre-dawn dark by an unseen hand. The envelope bore the printed letterhead of the law firm of Ashford and Pritchett of Boston, Massachusetts, and the letter inside it was dated November 28, 1887, and it was addressed to Miss Lenora Caroline Whitfield, care of the Blackwood Homestead, Thunder Ridge Valley, Wyoming Territory. The letter informed Lenora that her aunt, Mrs. Prudence Whitfield, accompanied by counsel and by Mr. Nathaniel Ashford, would be arriving at Rawlings Crossing by the first week of January, pursuant to a petition for custody and restoration of guardianship filed in the probate court of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and granted pending review. Wyatt read the letter aloud in the kitchen with Ezra and Silas standing at his shoulder and the three children at the table behind him. When he finished writing, he set the letter down on the kitchen table. He looked at Lenora. She looked back at him. And Lenora Caroline Whitfield, who had climbed a tree in her best dress, who had fired a rifle in a barn in a blizzard, who had nursed a fevered child through a 40-mile storm, who had buried her grief for 2 years in the silences of a house on Beacon Hill, reached into the pocket of her apron and took out the plain gold ring that had belonged to Mary Blackwood and then to Rebecca Blackwood, and slid it onto the fourth finger of her left hand. "Let her come," she said. The first week of January brought a thaw that nobody at Thunder Ridge had expected. It came up from the southwest on a wind that smelled of cedar and open country, and in the space of 3 days, the snow that had held the valley since December softened at its surface and hardened again at its base until a man could walk on the crust of it without breaking through. Wyatt stood on the front porch on the morning of the fourth day, and he looked at the crusted snow, and he looked at the sky, and he said to Lenora, who stood beside him with her hand on the small gold ring on the fourth finger of her left hand, "The trail will hold a wagon by Wednesday." Wednesday was the day the letter had said. They left at first light on the Tuesday before, the two of them in the small spring wagon with Judge in the traces, because Judge had the best wind of any horse on the place, and the road to Rawlings Crossing was long, and the weather in January was a matter a man did not take for granted. Ezra and Silas stood at the gate to see them off. Grace stood on the porch with Joss at one hip and Sammy at the other, and her face was the face of a 12-year-old girl who had been left in charge of a household before and who would not this time cry about it until the wagon was well out of sight. Wyatt slapped the reins. Judge stepped out. The valley fell away behind them. Lenora did not look back until they reached the crossroads where the pine board read Blackwood 2 miles, and she had set her trunk down in the mud on the evening of the 1st of October, 3 months ago and a lifetime ago. The board was still there. The trunk was not. Ezra had fetched it up to the house in the second week, and the clothes in it had long since been hung on pegs in her bedroom and mended and put to use. They drove for 4 days. On the evening of the fourth day, they came down out of the pass above Rawlings Crossing and saw the lights of the town spread out below them on the flat, and Wyatt pulled Judge up at the edge of the bench to let the horse blow, and he said to Lenora without looking at her, "I have not been to this town in near 2 years. Not since Silas and I brought Rebecca's stone back in the spring of '86. "I did not know that," Lenora said. "There is a room at the boarding house on Main Street kept by a woman named Pearl Haraway. She knew Rebecca. She was a friend to her. I wrote ahead to say we would be coming. She will have a room for us." Lenora put her hand on his forearm. He looked at her for the first time since the pass. "It will not be a comfortable room," Wyatt said, and his voice had gone rough in that way she knew now, meant he was ashamed of the thing he was about to say. "I did not know when I wrote to Pearl what our standing would be. I did not know whether the law in Boston would hold in Wyoming. I did not know whether you were still in the eyes of any court a ward of your aunt. I asked Pearl for 2 rooms. Lenora was quiet. "We can sleep where we must, Wyatt," she said. "I know. The gold ring you put on my finger is the only answer to that question that matters to me. I know that too." He slapped the reins again, and the wagon went down off the bench into the long street of Rawlings Crossing. And before they had reached the boarding house, Lenora had seen a woman standing on the boardwalk outside a small office with a sign above the door reading, "Clementine Nightingale, Attorney at Law." The woman was slender and dark-haired, perhaps 30 years old, and she wore a plain gray traveling dress and a man's overcoat 2 sizes too large for her, and she stepped down off the boardwalk as the wagon came abreast of her office, and she raised one gloved hand in a gesture that was neither a wave nor a signal, but something that was plainly meant to be noticed and not remarked upon. Wyatt pulled Judge to a halt. "Miss Whitfield," the woman said, looking up at Lenora. My name is Clementine Nightingale. I received your letter from the stage agent at Coal Creek 11 days ago." I have been expecting you. When you have seen to your lodgings, I should like to speak with you both in my office. There is a matter I have prepared for your arrival, and another matter that has arrived ahead of you, and I do not think either of them should be discussed in the middle of Main Street. Lenora climbed down from the wagon. She stood in the thawed mud of the January street, and she looked up at the woman who had made the journey from Cheyenne to Rawlings Crossing in the middle of a winter thaw to meet a mail-order bride from Boston, and she said very quietly, "Thank you for coming, Miss Nightingale. Thank me when this is over, Miss Whitfield. Lenora, please. Clementine. Clementine, then, for the duration of this matter." She turned and went back up onto the boardwalk, and Wyatt watched her go. And he said very low to Lenora, "She is going to be formidable." "I think she already is," Lenora said. The office of Clementine Nightingale was one long, narrow room with a pot-bellied stove in the middle and two mismatched chairs drawn up to a desk that had been made plainly by somebody local and somebody not entirely skilled. On the wall behind the desk hung a framed document with a seal on it that Lenora recognized after a moment as a certificate of admission to the Wyoming Territorial Bar. It was dated 1886. Clementine Nightingale was the third woman to hold such a certificate in the territory. They sat. Clementine poured 3 cups of coffee from a tin pot on the stove and set them down in front of Lenora and Wyatt without asking whether they wanted it, and she sat down behind the desk and she opened a folder and she looked at Lenora. "3 things have happened since I received your letter," she said. "I will take them in order. Please. 1. Your aunt arrived at Rawlings Crossing the day before yesterday. She is lodged at the Excelsior Hotel, which is the expensive one at the end of Main Street. She travels with 2 attorneys from the firm of Ashford and Pritchett of Boston. She travels with your former fiancé, Mr. Nathaniel Ashford. She travels with paperwork, which I have seen, which purports to establish her continuing guardianship over you under the terms of your late father's will." Lenora's hand tightened on Wyatt's. "2," said Clementine. "The paperwork is a forgery." Lenora looked at her. "I will explain," Clementine said. "In my investigation following your letter, I requested by telegraph a certified copy of the probate record of your father's estate from the Suffolk County Courthouse in Boston. I asked a colleague there to walk it to me personally because I did not wish it to pass through any office in which your aunt or her counsel might have influence. That copy arrived in my hands yesterday morning. The original will of Thomas Whitfield. Your father sets the term of your guardianship up at your 21st birthday, not your 25th. You passed that birthday in March of 1885. You have been a legal adult for 2 years and 10 months, Lenora. The document your aunt carries has been altered. The figure 21 has been struck through and the figure 25 inserted, and the alteration has been sealed with a seal that does not match the seal of the Suffolk County Probate Office in 1883. Wyatt made a sound in his throat that was not a word. 3, said Clementine. "Yes. I received 2 days ago a visitor at this office, a woman. She had traveled from Boston by the Union Pacific Railway and had arrived at Rawlings Crossing on the stage of the 29th of December. She said, come to speak to me because she had learned through certain channels that I was counsel of record for Miss Lenora Whitfield, who was resident at Thunder Ridge in the company of the Blackwood brothers. She had a thing she wished to say to me, and she wished to say it under oath, and she asked me whether I would record her statement as an officer of the court and preserve it for use at any future proceeding at which it might be needed." Lenora's throat had gone very dry. "Who?" she said. Clementine opened a second folder. "Her name," Clementine said, "is Dr. Esther Caldwell. She was for 20 years the physician of record for the household of your late father, Thomas Whitfield, at Lewisburg Square in Boston. She attended your mother in her final illness in 1872. She attended you when you took the scarlet fever in 1881. Lenora closed her eyes. "Open them, Lenora," Clementine said gently. "You will want to hear this from my mouth and not from anyone else's." Lenora opened her eyes. "Dr. Caldwell has given me a sworn deposition," Clementine said. The deposition states that in February of 1881, while you were recovering from the scarlet fever in your aunt's house, your Aunt Prudence Whitfield paid Dr. Caldwell the sum of $500 to deliver to you and to your fiancé, Nathaniel Ashford, a diagnosis of permanent sterility. The diagnosis was a lie. Dr. Caldwell states under oath that scarlet fever in a girl of your age does not produce sterility. It produces fatigue and a weakness of the heart that passes within 2 years. You were never barren, Lenore. You have never been barren. Your aunt paid a woman to tell you that you were because she understood that a barren bride would cast off by Nathaniel Ashford, and that a cast-off niece with no prospect of marriage could be kept in her house indefinitely, and that the trust fund your father had left you, which was to be released at your first child or your 30th birthday, whichever came first could thereby be held in her custody for 7 more years. 7 more years of income, 7 more years of control, 7 more years. Lenora could not speak. She sat in the chair in the office of Clementine Nightingale, and she looked at the small frame bar certificate on the wall, and she did not speak, and Wyatt did not speak either, and for a long minute, the only sound in the room was the pop of the wood in the pot-bellied stove. Finally, Wyatt said very quietly, "Why did she come?" Clementine looked at him. "Dr. Caldwell, yes." Clementine folded her hands on the desk. "Dr. Caldwell is 62 years old," she said. "She has been a physician in the city of Boston for 30 years. She has not in that time until now broken her word to a patient. She broke her word once in 1881 for $500, and she says in her deposition that she has not slept a full night since. She says that when she read in the Boston Herald in October of a young woman named Lenora Whitfield who had gone west to become a mail-order bride, and she understood that this was the girl whose life she had broken, she booked passage on the next train. She says she is here to give the truth she was paid to hide. She says she does not want the money back. She says she wants to look you in the face and ask your pardon, and then she will go back to Boston and present herself to the Suffolk County Medical Society for censure, and whatever comes of that will come." Lenora put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She sat there with her face in her hands for perhaps 2 minutes, and Wyatt's arm came around her shoulders and nobody spoke. And after a while, she sat up and she wiped her face with the back of her wrist, the way Grace had wiped her face on the morning at the hickory tree, and she said to Clementine, "Where is she now, Dr. Caldwell?" "Yes." "She is at the boarding house, the one called Pearl Haraway's. I put her there because it was the farthest lodging in Rawlings Crossing from the Excelsior Hotel." Lenora nodded once. "I will see her tonight," she said. "As you wish." And tomorrow, Lenora said, "I will see my aunt." The hearing, Clementine said, is set for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the office of the territorial magistrate. Your aunt has requested it. She believes it will be a routine matter of ratifying her guardianship and ordering your return to Boston. I have not corrected her belief. I did not think it wise to give her time to prepare. "You are formidable, Clementine," Wyatt said. "I am being paid," Clementine said. "Though not enough, she will be," Lenora said when this is over. That night, Lenora went alone to the boarding house of Pearl Haraway. Wyatt had asked if he might come with her, and she had said no, and he had accepted the no without argument, because he had learned in the 3 months since a woman in a Navy traveling dress had stepped down at the crossroads when to walk beside her and when to let her walk alone. Dr. Esther Caldwell was a small woman. That was the first thing Lenora noticed because she had remembered the doctor as tall, and the doctor was not. She had a plain face and tired eyes and gray hair pinned in a simple bun at the nape of her neck, and she rose from a chair by the window of the small sitting room when Lenora came in, and she did not try to embrace Lenora or offer her hand because she understood that those gestures were not hers to offer tonight. "Dr. Caldwell," Lenora said. "Miss Whitfield." "Lenora, please." "No," the doctor said. "I have not earned that." "Miss Whitfield." They sat. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the January thaw continued, and water dripped from the eaves with the small, patient sound of a thing that will outlast every silence offered to it. I am sorry, Dr. Caldwell said at last. I know. I took money to lie to you. I told you a thing that was not true, and I watched you carry the weight of that thing for 7 years, and I did nothing. I have no defense. I want you to understand that. I did not come here to defend myself. Why then? Because you deserve the truth before my grave, and I did not know how many winters I had left, and I did not wish to leave this world with this sin still unmade. Lenora looked at the woman. She thought about the 2 years on Beacon Hill. She thought about the cathedral. She thought about the face of Nathaniel Ashford turning away from her at the altar. She thought about the belief that had settled in her in the quiet hours of her aunt's third-floor bedroom, the belief that she was worth less than a field that could not grow wheat, and how that belief had shaped every choice she had made since, including the choice to answer the advertisement of a man named Wyatt Blackwood, who lived in a valley 4 days from the nearest church. You cost me 2 years of my life, Lenora said. I know. You cost me my first engagement. I know. You might have cost me more. I might never have come west. I might have stayed in that house and died there thinking myself a cursed thing. I know, Miss Whitfield, I know. And yet Lenora said slowly, and here she paused, and she looked at her own hands in her lap, and she thought about the hickory tree at the east end of the pasture, and she thought about Sammy asleep in his bed with his cloth rabbit under his chin, and she thought about Wyatt's arm around her shoulders in the office of Clementine Nightingale not 2 hours ago, and she thought about Grace's hand finding hers in the frost of the October morning, and she thought, if you had not lied to me, Dr. Caldwell, I would not have gone west, and I would not have found them. I would not have found any of them. And what she said aloud was, I do not know whether I can forgive you tonight, nor should you. But I will tell you this. If you had not done what you did, I would never have gone to Thunder Ridge. And there are 3 children in a valley in the Absaroka Mountains who would still be motherless, and there is a man there who would still be drowning, and there is a house there that would still be empty. I do not know what God I believe in anymore, Dr. Caldwell, but I know that I cannot curse the road that brought me where I am now, even though every stone in it was put there by a wrong. Dr. Caldwell was crying silently. She did not wipe her face. That is a larger mercy than I had hoped for, she said. It is not mercy. It is only the truth. You will have to earn the mercy yourself in whatever way you can. Tomorrow at the hearing, you will say aloud under oath what you have already said to Miss Nightingale. You will say it in front of my aunt, who paid you, and in front of the magistrate, and in front of the Boston attorneys, and in front of Nathaniel Ashford. And when it is over, you will go back to Boston, and you will present yourself to the medical society, and whatever they do to you, you will accept. And if your conscience is not satisfied by that, you will spend whatever remains of your life tending the sick who cannot pay, and you will remember my name and when you do it. Yes, Miss Whitfield. Lenora rose. At the door she paused. Dr. Caldwell, she said without turning. Yes, thank you for coming. She went out into the January thaw, and she walked back down Main Street to the other boarding house, where Wyatt was waiting for her on the porch with his hat in his hand, and she went up to him, and she laid her forehead against his chest, and he said nothing at all. And they stood there for a long time in the dripping dark, and when she finally looked up at him, she said, Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he said. The office of the territorial magistrate was a small room above the bank with 3 rows of wooden chairs for such citizens as cared to observe, and a long table at the front for the magistrate and such counsel as appeared. By the time Lenora and Wyatt arrived at 9:15 in the morning, Aunt Prudence Whitfield was already seated in the first row of chairs. She was dressed entirely in black. She had not aged a day in the 4 months since Lenora had last seen her, which was the morning Lenora had walked out of the house on Beacon Hill with a small leather valise in her hand. Aunt Prudence sat with her back straight and her gloved hands folded in her lap, and on either side of her sat a dark-suited attorney, and behind her sat Nathaniel Ashford, who had gained weight and whose face was the face of a man who had been told that this proceeding would be a formality and who was beginning for the first time to suspect that it might not be. Aunt Prudence turned her head as Lenora entered the room. Her eyes swept Lenora from the mended hem of her dress to the small gold ring on her left hand. Her expression did not change. "Lenora," she said, "Aunt, I see you have dressed yourself as a farm wife. I am a farm wife. You are a Whitfield. I am both. I did not know the two were in conflict." A Whitfield does not. Clementine Nightingale stepped between them. "Mrs. Whitfield," Clementine said, "if you have words to exchange with my client, you may do so through me as counsel. The magistrate will be in shortly." The magistrate, whose name was Ephraim Good, came in at 10 o'clock precisely. He was a tall, thin man of perhaps 60, with a gray beard trimmed close and a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles that he set on the bridge of his nose with great care before he looked up at the assembled persons in his courtroom. He read the papers before him. He took a sip of water. He said in a dry voice that carried to the back of the room, "This is the matter of Whitfield petition for ratification of guardianship and return of ward. I will hear first from counsel for the petitioner." The senior Boston attorney rose. His name was Ambrose Pritchett, and he was a man of considerable professional reputation east of the Mississippi. He stood and he bowed slightly to the bench, and he presented in polished language the case that Lenora Carolyn Whitfield, age 23, was under the legal guardianship of her aunt and next of kin, Mrs. Prudence Whitfield of Boston, Massachusetts, pursuant to the last will and testament of Thomas Whitfield, said guardianship to continue until the ward's attainment of her 25th year, and that the ward had in October of the preceding year absented herself from the household of her guardian without permission, and that her guardian now sought the assistance of the territorial court in returning the ward to her lawful custody. He presented the will. He presented it with a flourish. Ephraim Good took the document. He looked at it over his steel-rimmed spectacles. He turned the page. "Counsel," he said without looking up. "Yes, Your Honor, this document has been altered." Mr. Pritchett blinked. "I beg your pardon, Your Honor. The figure 21 has been struck through, and the figure 25 has been written over it. The seal on the alteration does not match the seal of the Suffolk County Probate Office, a specimen of which I keep in this drawer, because I have seen attempts of this kind before. Your Honor, I assure you that the document is a true copy. It is not," Ephraim Good said. "Counsel for the ward, what do you have to say?" Clementine Nightingale rose. "Your Honor," she said, "I have in my possession a certified copy of the original will of Thomas Whitfield, obtained directly from the Suffolk County Probate Office by my colleague, Miss Henrietta Ballard of the Boston Bar. It sets the term of the ward's guardianship at her 21st birthday. My client is 23. The petition before this court is moot." She laid the certified copy on the magistrate's table. The entire first row of chairs went very still. Aunt Prudence did not move. Ephraim Good read the second document. He set it down beside the first. "Mr. Pritchett," he said, "Your Honor, you are a member of the Massachusetts Bar in good standing. I am Your Honor. Were you aware when you presented this document to this court this morning that it had been altered? Your Honor, I was given this document by my client, and I had no reason to believe." "You had no reason to believe, I see." "Mrs. Whitfield," Aunt Prudence did not rise. "Mrs. Whitfield," Ephraim Good said again, "you will rise when you are addressed in my courtroom." She rose. "Mrs. Whitfield, it appears that you have presented to this court a forged instrument with the intent of obtaining a return of custody over an adult woman to whom you hold no legal relationship whatsoever. Do you have anything to say before I refer this matter to the United States Attorney for the District of Wyoming?" Aunt Prudence's face did not change. "Your Honor," she said, "there has been a misunderstanding." "There has been a felony," Ephraim Good said. "Sit down." She sat. "Counsel for the ward." Ephraim Good said, "You may call your witnesses." "I have one witness, Your Honor," Clementine said. "Dr. Esther Caldwell of Boston, Massachusetts." Dr. Caldwell rose from the second row of chairs. She walked to the front of the room. She was sworn. She spoke in a voice that did not waver for 11 minutes. She spoke of the winter of 1881 and of the scarlet fever and of the $500, and of the letter Mrs. Prudence Whitfield had written her requesting a diagnosis of permanent sterility for the purposes of discouraging a pending engagement, and of the letter she had written in reply, and of the diagnosis she had delivered, and of the cathedral, and of the 7 years of silence. She spoke to the magistrate, and she did not look once at Aunt Prudence, and when she was finished, she sat down in the witness chair, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Nathaniel Ashford made a sound from the second row. Ephraim Good looked at him. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "you have something to contribute." Nathaniel looked at Aunt Prudence. He looked at Lenora. He looked at the floor. He said, "Your Honor, I did not know. I swear to you I did not know. She told me only that Lenora was barren. She did not tell me how she knew. I would never have, I mean to say I would have a—" Mr. Ashford, Ephraim Good said gently, "You do not need to finish that sentence." Nathaniel sat down. He put his face in his hands. The rest of the morning passed as such mornings pass in the slow machinery of a law that is on its best days a thing of patience and of attention to documents. Ephraim Good dismissed the petition for guardianship. He issued a bench warrant for the arrest of Mrs. Prudence Whitfield on the charge of felony forgery to be executed at the close of proceedings. He issued a secondary warrant for Mr. Nathaniel Ashford to be held pending further investigation of his role as beneficiary of the 1881 arrangement. He referred the matter of Dr. Caldwell to the Suffolk County Medical Society with a letter of his own attached recommending, given her voluntary testimony at personal cost, that the society consider formal censure rather than revocation of her license. He directed the clerk of the court to prepare at the county's expense a certified document establishing Miss Lenora Caroline Whitfield as a person of full legal majority resident of Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, and engaged to marry Mr. Wyatt Blackwood of the same. He accepted from Clementine Nightingale for filing the trust paperwork for the $50,000 remaining in the estate of the late Thomas Whitfield to be released to his daughter Lenora upon her signature. At noon, he adjourned the court. Lenora walked out of the office above the bank on the arm of Wyatt Blackwood. On the boardwalk outside, the January sun was high and warm, and the icicles along the eaves of the Excelsior Hotel were falling one after another into the thawed mud of Main Street with a soft, insistent sound. Aunt Prudence was being escorted by the county deputy to the small brick building that served as the Rawlins Crossing jail. She did not look at Lenora as she passed. She did not look at anyone. She walked with her back straight and her gloved hands folded as though she were being escorted to a charity luncheon at the Athenaeum. And Lenora understood, watching her, that her aunt would go to her death having never acknowledged in any part of her soul that she had done a wrong thing. Lenora did not feel triumph. She felt a thing that was quieter and older and more like pity. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes, let us go home." The Reverend Hollis came out from Rawlins Crossing a week later at the end of the January thaw and married them under the hickory tree at the east end of the pasture. It was a small ceremony. Ezra played the banjo. Silas, in a clean white shirt and a coat that had not been out of the cedar chest in 4 years, stood up as witness for his brother. Grace walked Lenora to the tree in the blue dress that had been her mother's, which she had herself laid out on Lenora's bed the morning of the wedding, and had said without meeting Lenora's eyes she would have wanted you to have it. Joss and Sammy stood together at the foot of the tree, Sammy with his cloth rabbit in the crook of one arm and his small hand in the larger hand of his brother. Dr. Caldwell did not attend. She had gone back to Boston to face the medical society. Clementine Nightingale sent a wire. The Reverend Hollis said the words that such men say, and Wyatt said, "I do," and Lenora said, "I do," and Wyatt slid the gold ring of Mary Blackwood onto Lenora's finger for the second time, and they kissed under the bare hickory branches while the 3 children watched, and Ezra kept playing something on the banjo that Lenora did not know the name of, but that Grace was humming along to because it had been, Lenora would learn later, her mother's favorite. That night, when the 3 children were asleep and the 2 brothers had retired to the bunkhouse, with the kind of tact that Ezra had always possessed, and Silas had learned, Wyatt carried Lenora over the threshold of the upstairs bedroom that had been hers since October, and the door closed behind them, and outside the first true snow of the new year began to fall softly over Thunder Ridge, and the valley settled into itself. By morning, everything had changed between them. By morning also, nothing had. The spring came early that year. By the first week of April, the trail to Rawlings Crossing was open, and the creek from Silent Mountain was running full, and the pasture at the east end where the hickory tree stood was greening in patches through the last of the crust. Ezra rode to town for salt and flour and was gone 4 days instead of 2, and when he came back, he was whistling, and Cordelia Jenkins began within the month to send letters in a careful schoolgirl hand. They were married in June. Ezra built them a small cabin a quarter-mile up the creek so that they might have privacy and yet be close enough for Sunday supper, and Cordelia, who turned out to be a woman of considerable opinion and very little patience for nonsense, began almost at once the project of reforming the worst of Ezra's habits, which was the habit of not finishing his smiles. By August, she had nearly finished that project. Lenora discovered in May that she was with child. She told Wyatt on the porch on a Sunday evening, and Wyatt was quiet for a long time, and then he went out to the barn, and he did not come back for nearly an hour. And when he came back, his eyes were red, and he did not pretend otherwise. And he sat down on the step beside her, and he took her hand, and he said, "We will send for Dr. Caldwell." "Will she come?" Lenora said. "She will come." Dr. Caldwell came in the 8th month. She had been censured but not stripped of her license, and she had spent the intervening year attending the poor of the Boston North End without charge, and she had eaten little and slept less. And when she arrived at Thunder Ridge, she was thinner than Lenora remembered, and her gray hair had gone nearly white at the temples, and she came up the wagon road with her black bag in her lap, and she stepped down into the yard, and Lenora met her at the gate. The two women did not embrace. They looked at each other for a long moment across the gatepost, and then Lenora opened the gate, and Dr. Caldwell stepped through, and Lenora said, "Welcome home, Esther." Dr. Caldwell broke then in a way that Lenora had never seen a grown woman break, and Lenora held her until she was done. The baby was a girl. She was born on the morning of the 19th of September, 1888, with Dr. Caldwell at the bedside and Grace, now 13, at the head of the bed holding Lenora's hand, and Wyatt in the kitchen pacing a groove in the pine floor that would still be visible 40 years later. They named her Rebecca Mary Blackwood after the mother Grace had lost and the grandmother the Blackwood brothers had buried in the winter of '68. When Sammy, 7 years old and talking now in complete sentences, though still more quietly than other children his age, was allowed into the room to meet his sister, he climbed onto the bed without asking, and he put his cloth rabbit into the crook of the baby's arm, and he said very seriously to Lenora, "This is Mr. Rabbit. He will look after her. I am old enough now." Dr. Caldwell stayed at Thunder Ridge for 2 months. When she left, Lenora walked her to the gate. At the gate, Dr. Caldwell turned. "Lenora," she said. "Yes, Esther. Thank you." "For what?" "For the name you are giving me the right to carry again." She rode out. The years went. A boy came in the spring of '92. They named him Wyatt after his father, and he was from the beginning a serious child, less like his father than like his namesake grandfather, whom none of them had ever met. Silas, who had never quite given up his belief that he would go through the world alone, courted the schoolmistress at Rawlings Crossing, Miss Abigail Shaw, for the better part of 2 years, and married her in the spring of '94 in the small white chapel that Lenora had caused to be built on a piece of donated ground at the south end of Thunder Ridge Valley, so that the Reverend Hollis and those who came after him would no longer have to ride 4 days each way to reach the families of the settlements. Silas built his own cabin a half-mile down the creek from Ezra's. By the spring of '96, there were 3 households on Thunder Ridge, and the chickens ran from one yard to another in the manner of chickens who understand that they belong to all 3 families at once. Grace went to the normal school at Denver in '93 at the age of 18, with a trunk that Lenora had helped her pack and a stipend from the Whitfield Trust that Lenora had insisted upon over Grace's protestations. She graduated in '95. She came home to Rawlings Crossing and took the post of head teacher at the new school that the county had built, and she held that post for the next 25 years. and she never married, though she was in later years known as a favorite aunt to a great many children and as a force of improvement in the educational prospects of Carbon County that nobody in the county was foolish enough to oppose more than once. Joss grew tall. By 1897, he was 19 and taller than his father, and by 99, he had gone in with his father and uncles on a second ranch at a valley over in Idaho, and he ran that ranch for the rest of his life. And he married in 1903 a young woman named Susanna Parnell, whose family had come west from Ohio and who bore him 5 children and outlived him by 20 years. Sammy did not grow tall. Sammy grew slender and dark-eyed and quiet, and by 15 he had read every book in the small library that Lenora had put together at the school in Rawlings Crossing, and by 18 he was writing poems, and by 22 he had published in a small press in Denver a volume of poems called Mountain Child's Silent Tongue, which was noticed improbably by a critic in New York, who wrote that the author had a way of saying difficult things in plain language that reminded the reviewer of Walt Whitman. Sammy did not go to New York. He stayed at Thunder Ridge. He wrote 4 more volumes over the course of his life, and in the 4th of them, published when he was 30, there was a poem called For My Second Mother, which began with the line, "You smelled like bread," in which Lenora could never read without having to put the book down and walk out onto the porch. The years went. It was the autumn of 1927 when Lenora Caroline Blackwood, 63 years old, her honey blonde hair long since gone to silver, and her cornflower blue eyes gone softer at the corners, sat on the porch of the house at Thunder Ridge and watched her grandchildren chase each other through the last of the wildflowers in the east pasture. Wyatt, 74, sat beside her on the porch swing that Ezra had built them as a silver wedding gift. His beard had gone entirely white. His hand, which lay on hers, still carried the small scar across the knuckles where the skin had split during the ride through the blizzard of '87. And the scar was paler now than it had been, but still visible, and sometimes in the mornings when Wyatt's hand ached from the cold, Lenora would warm it between her own as she had done on the first night. The ranch had grown. The original house still stood. It had been added to 3 times, and a bathroom had been put in 1911, and electricity had come from a gasoline generator in 1921, and a telephone line had reached Thunder Ridge in 1924, and Wyatt had refused to answer it for the first 6 months on principle. But the original walls, the squared timber that 3 orphan boys had raised in 1870, were the same walls. The stones in the 2 chimneys were the same stones. The porch floorboards, which had been replaced 3 times over the decades, had each time been cut from the same stand of lodgepole pine at the foot of Silent Mountain, and the small shoes of a child who had died before she could wear them still sat on a shelf in the kitchen, because nobody in the house had ever quite been able to move them, and nobody ever would. Ezra, now 71, was on the other end of the porch playing softly on his banjo, the tune he had played at his brother's wedding 40 years before. He lived still in the cabin up the creek with Cordelia, who had entirely finished the project of reforming his smile, and he had 5 grown children and 11 grandchildren, and he went to town every Saturday in a Model T that he drove his grandchildren that all agreed with more caution than any vehicle in Carbon County had ever been driven. Silas, 68, sat on the steps with a small boy of 4 on his knee. The boy was one of his own grandchildren, and Silas was teaching him patiently the names of the 3 mountains: Thunder Peak, Eagles Ridge, Silent Mountain. The boy could not say Silent Mountain. He said Cylon Mountain. Silas corrected him once and then let the thing pass because Silas Blackwood had learned over the course of his life when to correct a child and when to let a thing pass, and he had learned it primarily from his sister-in-law. Grandmother, a small voice said. Lenora looked down. A girl of 7 was standing at her knee. She had Rebecca Mary's dark eyes because she was Rebecca Mary's second daughter, whose name was Mary Lenora, and she was holding a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. "Grandmother," she said, "can you write down the names of everybody in the family?" "I am making a tree." Lenora took the paper and the pencil. She sat for a while, a moment with the pencil poised. "There are a great many names," she said. "I know," Mary Lenora said. "That is why I came to you." Lenora began to write. She wrote at the top of the paper Wyatt Blackwood and Lenora Caroline Whitfield, 1887. Below that, she wrote Rebecca Marion Wyatt II, and then she wrote the names of the children of those children because there were five now between the two of them. She wrote Ezra and Cordelia with the names of their five children. She wrote Silas and Abigail with the names of their three. She wrote Grace, and she put a line under Grace with no name below it, but she wrote the names of the 22 students who had named their own children after Grace in the last 30 years, and then she ran out of room at the bottom of the paper, and she had to continue on the back. She wrote Joss and Susanna and their five. She wrote Sammy, and below Sammy she wrote the name of his wife, a quiet woman from Laramie, whom he had married late at the age of 39, and with whom he had had one child, a daughter named Esther, after the doctor, who had eventually retired to Thunder Ridge in her last years, and who had been laid to rest beside Rebecca Blackwood under the hickory tree in 1904. When Lenore had finished, she counted the names. 41, she said, not counting us. Mary Lenore looked at the paper. That is a lot of people, she said. Yes, Lenore said. Mary Lenore considered the paper. Grandmother, she said. Yes. Were you always here? Lenore set the pencil down. She looked out across the pasture toward the hickory tree, which was now more than a century old, and which had in recent years begun to shed a major limb every few winters, but which still stood its bare autumn branches black against the gold of the late afternoon light, and under which the small, flat granite stone of Rebecca Blackwood had been joined over the years by the stones of Mary Blackwood the elder, whose bones Lenore had ordered brought down from the original burial plot near the old sod dugout, and of the infant who had not lived in 1883, and of Dr. Esther Caldwell, and of Thomas Whitfield and his wife Caroline, whose remains Lenore had caused to be brought out by rail from Boston in 1920 and reinterred here so that her father and mother might at last lie under open sky and country that did not measure a woman by the children she could bear. No, Mary Lenore, Lenore said. Where did you come from? From a city, very far east, a city by the ocean. I came here on a stagecoach a very long time ago. How long ago? 40 years. Last October. That is a long time. Yes, why did you come? Lenora smiled. She thought about how to answer. I came, she said, because a man in this valley wrote me a letter. The letter said, come if you can stay. And you could stay. And I could stay. Mary Lenore nodded as though this were a satisfactory answer to a question she had not known she was asking. She took the paper back. She went down the porch steps past her great-uncle Silas and the small boy and out into the yard, and she ran across the brown grass toward the pasture, and one of her cousins chased her. Lenora watched them go. Wyatt squeezed her hand. What are you thinking, he said. I am thinking, she said, that the girl who stepped down at the crossroads 40 years ago thought her life was over. And now, she said, I think it was only beginning. The sun set behind Thunder Peak. Ezra played something on the banjo that none of them knew the name of. 7 years later, in the autumn of 1934, Lenora Caroline Blackwood sat in the same rocking chair on the same porch, her hand in her husband's, and she closed her eyes for the last time, and Wyatt, who would follow her in 11 days, bent his head over her and did not weep, because she had told him once that weeping was a kind of argument with God. And she had asked him if it came to it to let her go without argument. They were buried together beside the hickory tree. Ezra survived until 1941. Silas, the youngest, and in so many ways the one who had fought hardest to become what he finally became, lived until 1952, the last of the three brothers of Thunder Ridge. And at his funeral, his great-nephew Wyatt III read aloud a passage from the 4th volume of Sammy Blackwood's poetry, which ended with the line, "The mountain chose us all." The ranch passed to the children. It passed over the decades through floods and droughts in 2 world wars, and the coming of the highway in the 1950s, and the coming of the Forest Service boundary in the 1960s, and the original house still stood. The walls were the same walls. The porch floorboards were cut from the same timber. Above the front door, nailed there in 1888 by Ezra Blackwood, there was a small hickory plank with 3 lines carved into it in the careful hand of a man who had taken his time, over a thing he intended to outlast him. You are home now, built with our own hands. The mountain chose us all. It hangs there still,